Sometimes the choices we make and the secrets we keep can completely alter the course of human lives. In some cases, these choices are driven by a deep, aching desire to heal a broken past and find a way to make things right. In other cases, they are driven by greed, power, and a shocking level of corruption that completely blinds a person to the value of human life. And in the most tragic cases, they are driven by a quiet, toxic malice that operates completely outside the boundaries of the law, leaving behind a devastation that can never truly be repaired. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible stories that show just how unpredictable and sometimes how utterly terrifying the human experience can be. We begin in the summer of 2007. A 60-year-old man named Michael Dick was living a very quiet, comfortable life in Bow, which is located in East London. Michael was a semi-retired carpenter, and if you were to look at his day-to-day routine, it was pretty normal. He spent most of his time helping out around the house, visiting with his close friends, and being with his family. He was well liked in his neighborhood, which was a peaceful, safe place to live. But even though his life seemed complete on the surface, Michael was harboring a deep, quiet sadness that had been growing inside of him for a very long time. 10 years earlier, back in 1997, Michael had gone through a very messy, painful divorce with his first wife. At the time of the split, they had a daughter together named Lisa, who was 21 years old. When the divorce was finalized, Michael decided he needed a fresh start to escape the bitterness of the separation. He packed up his things and moved about an hour and a half south down to Bow in East London. But his ex-wife and his daughter, Lisa, stayed behind in the family home, which was located in a quiet, historic town called Sudbury in the county of Suffolk, England. Because the divorce had been so hostile and bitter, the communication between Michael and his old family completely broke down. There were no phone calls, no letters, and no updates. As the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into years, Michael completely lost touch with his daughter Lisa. He did not know what she was doing with her life, whether she went to university, if she got married, or if she was even happy. It was like she had vanished from his world entirely. Fast forward 10 years to 2007. Michael is sitting in his home, and suddenly he is hit with this overwhelming, crushing wave of grief. He realized that a whole decade had passed, and he had missed out on his first daughter's entire young adulthood. The guilt of letting those 10 years slip away became absolutely too much for him to bear. He could not stop thinking about her. So he sat down with his current wife and his 2 younger daughters, and he told them that he had to go find Lisa. He needed to apologize for the lost time, and he wanted to rebuild a relationship with her if she would let him. His family was incredibly supportive. They told him he absolutely had to do it and that they would help him in any way they could. But the problem was, Michael had absolutely no idea where Lisa was. He did not have her phone number, he did not have an email address, and he had no way of contacting his ex-wife to ask for help because they had cut all ties. The only piece of information he had was the physical address of the brick house they had lived in 10 years ago in Sudbury. And so, in August of 2007, Michael decided that this old house was going to be his starting point. He got into the car with his 2 younger daughters, and they made the 90-minute drive north to Sudbury. When they arrived, Michael navigated through the familiar streets until he found his old neighborhood. It was a beautiful, quiet street lined with classic brick houses on both sides. He slowly drove down the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, until he spotted his old family home. He pulled the car over, parked right out front, and just sat there for a moment, staring at the front door. His heart was pounding with a mix of hope and sheer anxiety. He stepped out of the car alone, walked up the stone path, took a deep breath, and knocked on the door. After a few moments, the door opened. But the person standing there was not his ex-wife, and it was not Lisa. It was a completely different family who had moved in years after Michael left. Michael politely explained who he was and who he was looking for, but the new owners told him that they had bought the house from someone else and had no idea where the previous occupants had moved. They wished him the best of luck, but they had absolutely no information to give him. Michael thanked them, walked slowly back to his car, and sat in the driver's seat, feeling completely crushed. He looked at his daughters and told them that the trail was completely cold and he did not know what to do next. But his daughters refused to let him give up. They suggested that they just drive around Sudbury for a while. Maybe they would get incredibly lucky and spot Lisa walking down the street, or maybe just seeing the town would spark an idea. So they spent the next couple of hours just aimlessly driving around the streets of Sudbury, looking out the windows and talking about what they should do next. As they drove, they came to the realization that their best bet at finding Lisa was to get some sort of story in the local newspaper. They hoped that if they could get an article published, Lisa, or perhaps someone who knew her, would see it and contact Michael. So they drove to the headquarters of the local paper, the Suffolk Free Press, and went inside. They managed to speak to a reporter and explained Michael's situation. The reporter thought it was a very touching, interesting human interest story and agreed to write a small feature about Michael's search. The reporter, along with a photographer, brought Michael and his two younger daughters outside onto the street. The photographer had them stand together, and he took a picture of them. The reporter told Michael that in the next edition of the paper, which would run in just a few days, they would publish this picture along with a write-up about his search and his contact information. Michael thanked them profusely, feeling a tiny spark of hope. He and his daughters got back in the car and headed back to Bow, East London to wait. Now, what Michael did not know was that at that exact same time, Lisa was actually beginning to think about finding him too. Lisa was now 31 years old, she was married, she had 3 kids of her own, and she had moved out of Sudbury to a neighboring town. She had been talking to her mother and her friends about how she should go about finding her dad because she wanted her kids to have a relationship with him. But like Michael, she did not have his contact information, she did not have his phone number, and when she searched for him on social media, he was not on there. One day in August, Lisa was at her office. She went into the break room to get a drink, and she saw a copy of the Suffolk Free Press sitting on the coffee table. She picked it up and began casually flipping through the pages. Suddenly, she stopped. She saw a picture of herself. In the background of the main photo, she could clearly see herself and her mother walking along the street. She had been in Sudbury just a couple of days earlier to talk to her mom about how to find her dad, and they had walked down that very street. But then Lisa looked at the main subjects of the photo, the people standing in the foreground. It was a middle-aged man and 2 teenage girls. She stared at the man's face and nearly fell off her chair. It was her father, Michael, and her 2 stepsisters, whom she had never met. She looked at the caption for the photo and read the article. It explained that this man was desperately searching for his daughter, Lisa, whom he had not seen in 10 years. Purely by chance, on the only day Lisa had been in Sudbury talking to her mother about finding her father, she had been walking literally 100 feet behind her father and her stepsisters as they were having their picture taken for the newspaper ad. The photographer had captured all of them in the same frame without even realizing it. Lisa immediately read the article, got her father's contact information, and reached out to him. Initially, when Michael answered the phone and Lisa told him who she was and how she found him, he actually thought it was a scam. He did not believe it was actually her. But eventually she convinced him and he drove right back to Sudbury. They had an incredibly emotional reunion, and Michael got to meet his grandchildren for the very first time. Today, they are still a close part of each other's lives, all because of an unbelievable 1 in a million coincidence captured in a single newspaper photograph. That is a story of a long search ending in a beautiful, almost miraculous way. But our next story takes us to a very different part of the world, where a man's search for fame and power led to something incredibly dark and deeply disturbing. If you were to picture the Amazon rainforest in your head, you would probably imagine a dense, green, tropical wilderness filled with exotic animals and winding rivers. And you would be right. That is a very accurate representation of the Amazon. But what a lot of people do not know is that the Amazon rainforest is also home to a massive, bustling city. It is called Manaus, and it sits right in the middle of the rainforest, right along the banks of the Amazon River. Manaus is a city of extremes, and unfortunately, it happens to be one of the most violent places in the entire world. In Manaus, the drug trade and gang violence are extremely prevalent. All it takes is walking down the wrong street or crossing the wrong person, and you can get shot or stabbed in broad daylight with virtually nothing anyone can do to stop it. The police are often overwhelmed, underfunded, and sometimes even complicit in the chaos. In 1989, a 31-year-old former police officer named Wallace Souza decided that he wanted to do something about the state of his hometown. He wanted to make a television show that would show people what it was actually like to live in Manaus. Now, there were other crime shows in Brazil at the time, but they often censored the most graphic content. They would blur out the bodies or avoid showing the true horror of the crime scenes. Wallace decided he was not going to do that. He felt that the only way to expose the harsh reality of life in Manaus was to show everything without any filter. So, that year, he launched a show called Canal Livre, which translates to Free Channel. True to his word, there was absolutely no filter on what went on the air. The show was shocking, raw, and incredibly graphic. Viewers were given a front row seat to freshly murdered victims, lying in the road, slumped over chairs in restaurants, or dead behind the steering wheels of their cars. The cameramen would zoom in on the fatal injuries, the blood spatter, and the faces of the deceased. They would show the grieving family members crying out in pain, completely raw and unedited. But in between these very dark, violent segments about gang killings and drug deals gone wrong, Canal Livre also had a much lighter, almost bizarre side. They would bring on local artists to talk about their work, or they would focus on down-on-their-luck families that needed help, using the show to raise money for them. And then, for seemingly no reason at all, there was a recurring segment where a puppet character would get into physical fights with a man selling bread. It was a totally strange, chaotic spectacle, and the people of Manaus absolutely loved it. Eventually, the show became incredibly popular, not just in Manaus, but across all of Brazil. Because Wallace was often on camera hosting the show, he became extremely famous and highly recognizable. When he walked down the streets of Manaus, people would see him and literally start clapping and cheering for him. He was seen as a hero who was brave enough to show the truth that the government wanted to hide. As his popularity grew, Wallace decided that he did not just want to report on crime, he wanted to fight it from a position of authority. On the air, he would constantly berate the government for failing to protect its citizens, and he would mock the police for their inability to catch criminals. Off the air, he decided to run for political office. He campaigned hard on a platform of law and order, promising to clean up the streets of Manaus. He was elected with a massive majority, and he quickly became one of the most beloved, influential, and trusted public figures in all of Brazil. However, over the years, there was one very strange thing about Canal Livre that some people began to notice. It was a detail that was hard to ignore, and it was most obvious in a now famous episode that aired in the mid-2000s. This particular episode opens with a Canal Livre reporter making their way through a dense patch of jungle. A cameraman is filming them from behind as they push branches out of the way and carefully step over the thick underbrush. Up ahead, there is a small clearing, and standing in this clearing is a third person who is looking down at something on the ground. The reporter finally makes his way into the clearing, and the cameraman follows, pointing the camera down at the ground. What you see on the ground looks like a black, charred log that is still smoking. But as the cameraman zooms in, you realize it is not a log at all. It is a human being. The body is badly burned and still actively smoking, meaning this person had been set on fire just minutes before the camera crew arrived. It was a horrifying sight. But then, the reporter starts talking about the victim with an incredible amount of detail. He tells the audience that the victim is a man, that he had not been shot, and that he had been doused with gasoline and burned alive. The problem was, the police had not even arrived at the scene yet. No medical examiner had looked at the body, and because the body was so badly charred, it was virtually impossible to tell just by looking at it whether the victim was male, whether there were gunshot wounds, or what accelerant had been used. When people began to question how Canal Livre always managed to arrive at these crime scenes so quickly, and how they had so much detailed information before the police, Wallace had a quick answer. He told them that they were simply a very popular show with a huge network of informants, that people called them before they called the police, and that they constantly monitored police radios and the city morgue. For a long time, people accepted this explanation. But everything changed in October of 2008. That month, the police arrested a former Manaus police officer who went by the name Moa. He was accused of committing 9 murders and was thrown into jail. Despite the incredibly serious charges against him, Moa seemed completely unfazed. He acted like a man who knew he had powerful connections on the outside, someone who would step in at any moment and get him out of prison. But as the weeks went on, nobody came to save Moa. He just continued to sit in his cell, and eventually the reality of his situation began to sink in. He realized he had been abandoned. So he decided to start talking, and the story he told would shock the entire nation of Brazil. Moa admitted to the police that he had killed several people. But then he said that he was just a hitman. He claimed that the person who was hiring him to commit these murders was none other than Wallace Souza. The police began a massive, secret investigation. What they discovered was absolutely mind-blowing. It turned out that Wallace Souza had started Canal Livre with good intentions, but as the show became massively popular, it gave him an immense amount of power and influence. And that power corrupted him completely. Wallace had secretly formed his own powerful drug cartel. In order to protect his drug territory, eliminate his rivals, and boost his television show's ratings, Wallace had started hiring hitmen like Moa to assassinate rival gang members. Wallace would tell the hitmen exactly who to kill, where to do it, and at what exact time. Once the hit was planned, Wallace would coordinate with his news producers. He would send his camera crews to the exact location of the planned murder, timing it so they would arrive either right as the crime was happening or immediately after. This allowed Canal Livre to get the absolute most graphic, exclusive footage before any other news outlet and long before the police could even secure the scene. They were literally creating the news they were reporting on. It took the police a full year to compile enough evidence, but in October of 2009, they finally charged Wallace Souza with murder, conspiracy, and drug trafficking. Wallace initially went on the run, but he eventually turned himself in, maintaining his innocence and claiming that he was the victim of a political conspiracy. However, Wallace would never stand trial. Before his case could go before a judge, he suffered a massive heart attack and died in prison in 2010. Because of his death, the full extent of his crimes was never fully revealed, and we will never know exactly how many people he had killed for the sake of his television ratings. But investigators were able to prove that at least 3 of the victims shown on Canal Livre had been killed directly on Wallace's orders, including the man who had been burned alive in the jungle. But the story does not end there. The person who paid the ultimate price for exposing this massive conspiracy was Moa, the hitman who had blown the whistle on Wallace. On New Year's Day in 2017, a massive violent prison riot broke out at the facility where Moa was being held. A powerful crime syndicate overran the guards and took control of the prison, and they had a specific list of targets they wanted to eliminate. One of those targets was Moa, whom they viewed as a traitor for cooperating with the police. An angry mob of armed inmates made their way to Moa's cell. When they found him, Moa was pressed flat against the back wall of his cell, as far away from the bars as he could possibly get, pleading for his life. The mob, armed with machetes and knives, began hacking at the cell door, trying to break the lock to get inside and cut him to pieces. But the lock was too strong, and they could not get the door open. Realizing they could not reach him with their blades, they decided to do something else. They reached through the bars with a lighter and set Moa's mattress on fire. The flames quickly spread, filling the tiny cell with thick, toxic smoke and intense heat. With nowhere to run and no way to escape, Moa was trapped. He was burned alive inside his cell, suffering the exact same horrific fate that he and Wallace had inflicted on their victims years before. This is a terrifying example of how greed and a desire for control can lead to absolute horror. But sometimes, control does not come from a drug cartel or a television show. Sometimes it comes from someone you trust completely, someone you consider to be your very best friend. And that brings us to our third and final story, which took place in Sydney, Australia. In 2010, an 18-year-old girl named Renee Marsden was living in Sydney with her parents and her 3 siblings. Renee was a very bright, outgoing, and popular young woman who had a large circle of friends. She was also incredibly close with her family, especially with her mother, Teresa. Teresa had given birth to Renee when she was only 19 years old. Because of their relatively close age gap as Renee grew into a young woman, their relationship evolved from a traditional mother-daughter dynamic into a deep, trusting friendship. Renee saw her mother as her ultimate confidant. She would come home and tell Teresa absolutely everything that was going on in her life, from her daily routines to her deepest secrets. In 2010, Renee was going through a very difficult time. She had been dating a young man for nearly 2 years, and she was madly in love with him. But one day, she discovered a series of text messages that made it clear he was cheating on her and did not really care about her. Renee was completely heartbroken. She confronted her boyfriend with the messages, but he completely denied sending them. He swore up and down that he had never cheated on her, that he loved her, and that he had no idea where those messages had come from. But Renee, feeling betrayed and confused, did not believe him. She felt she had no choice but to break up with him. During this painful period, Renee spent hours talking to her mother, crying and trying to process the end of her relationship. Teresa did her best to comfort her daughter, telling her that time heals all wounds and that she would eventually find the right person who would treat her with the respect she deserved. For a couple of weeks, Renee was deeply depressed. She barely wanted to leave her room. But then, quite suddenly, she came home from work one day and walked through the front door with a massive smile on her face. She was practically radiating happiness, which was a huge contrast to how she had been acting. Teresa immediately noticed the change and asked her what had happened to put her in such a great mood. Renee smiled and told her mother that she had met a new guy. Teresa was thrilled to see her daughter happy again, and she eagerly asked who this new person was. Renee explained that his name was Braden Spiteri. He was 23 years old, and he came from a very wealthy, prominent family. He had graduated from the King's School, which is an extremely prestigious boys' school in Sydney, and his father owned a highly successful construction company that Braden was set to inherit. Renee described him as handsome, kind, and absolutely perfect. Teresa asked how they had met, and Renee explained that her best friend, Camilla Zidon, had introduced them. Camilla and Renee had been best friends since high school, and Camilla was always over at the Marsden house, so Teresa knew her very well. Renee told her mother that Braden was actually Camilla's ex-boyfriend, but they had dated a long time ago, and there were absolutely no lingering feelings between them. They were just good friends now. According to Renee, Camilla had seen how depressed Renee was after her breakup, and she wanted to help her find happiness again. So, Camilla had set her up with Braden. When Teresa heard this, a small red flag went up in her mind. She knew that dating a best friend's ex-boyfriend could easily lead to drama and hurt feelings, even if everyone claimed to be fine with it. She looked at Renee and asked if she really thought it was a good idea to get involved with Camilla's ex. But Renee quickly brushed her concerns aside, saying that Camilla was completely supportive and just wanted her to be happy. Still feeling a bit uneasy, Teresa asked to see a picture of this new guy. Renee pulled out her phone and showed her a photo of Braden. He was indeed a very handsome young man with a bright, welcoming smile. But as Teresa looked closer at the photo, she noticed something that made her uncomfortable. In the picture, Camilla was leaning her head heavily on Braden's shoulder, looking very much like his girlfriend. Teresa kept her thoughts to herself, but she could not shake the feeling that this situation was complicated and potentially dangerous. Over the next few weeks and months, Renee's relationship with Braden seemed to blossom rapidly. They were texting each other constantly, day and night. Renee had her phone out almost 24 hours a day, smiling at her screen as she exchanged messages with Braden. But as the months went by, Teresa noticed something odd. Renee and Braden had still not met up in person since they began officially dating. Every single time they made plans to meet, something would come up at the last minute. Either Braden would have an emergency at work, or Renee would have a family conflict. It was always some seemingly legitimate excuse, but it happened every single time. Eventually, the couple stopped trying to arrange face-to-face meetings altogether. It was as if they had built this incredibly intense, emotional relationship entirely through their phone screens, and actually meeting in person had become too intimidating or awkward. They were completely content just living in this digital world together. This unusual text-only relationship continued for nearly a year until January of 2012, when a massive tragedy struck. Braden was involved in a horrific motorcycle accident. He survived the crash, but his passenger, who was also his best friend, a young man named Richie, did not survive. He was killed instantly. The police investigated the accident and determined that Braden had been driving recklessly, and he was subsequently charged with manslaughter. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. When Teresa heard about the accident, she felt a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, she felt terrible for the young man who had lost his life and for Braden's family. But on the other hand, a protective, motherly part of her felt a sense of relief. She assumed that with Braden going to prison for 2 years, the relationship would naturally come to an end. She hoped that Renee would finally move on and find someone she could actually spend time with in the real world. But that is not what happened. Braden was sent to Goulburn Prison, a high-security facility located about 2 hours south of Sydney. Shortly after he arrived, Renee informed her family that Braden's family had somehow managed to smuggle a mobile phone into the prison for him. And just like that, their constant texting resumed, as if nothing had changed. Renee's family was deeply unhappy about this. They tried to talk to her, telling her that she was wasting her youth on a man in prison and that this relationship was heading down a very dark and difficult path. But Renee refused to listen. She was completely devoted to Braden. In fact, over the next several months, their relationship only grew more intense. They made plans to get married as soon as Braden was released, which was scheduled for late 2013. Renee was overjoyed and began throwing herself into wedding preparations. She spent hours online buying a beautiful wedding tiara on eBay, booking a professional photographer, and even contacting the Greek consulate to see if Braden, as a convicted felon, would be allowed to enter Greece for their planned honeymoon. But then, in August of 2013, just 2 months before Braden's scheduled release date, everything began to unravel in a very strange way. One afternoon, Teresa received a text message on her phone. It was from Braden, which was highly unusual because he rarely communicated with Teresa directly. The message was frantic. It told Teresa that she needed to check on Renee immediately because she was talking about ending her life. Terrified, Teresa ran straight to Renee's bedroom. She found Renee sitting quietly on her bed. Teresa sat down beside her, put a comforting hand on her shoulder, and asked if she was okay and what was going on. Renee looked up, seemingly confused, and said that she was fine, and asked why her mother was asking. Teresa showed her the text message from Braden. As soon as Renee saw the screen, her face fell. She let out a heavy sigh, looked at her mother, and said that they had just broken up and that their relationship was completely over. She insisted that she was not going to hurt herself, but that she was just incredibly sad. Teresa felt a sudden wave of relief mixed with deep sympathy for her daughter. She knew how painful breakups were, but she also believed that this was the best possible outcome for Renee's future. She stayed with Renee for a while, talking and comforting her until Renee seemed to calm down. Renee then told her mother that she wanted to go out that night with her friends to try and clear her head and forget about the breakup. Teresa thought this was a healthy idea. She sat on the bed and watched as Renee stood in front of the mirror, putting on her makeup and getting dressed up. When she was ready, Renee gave her mother a tight hug, kissed her on the cheek, and said she would see her later. Then she walked out the door. A few hours later, Teresa's phone buzzed. It was a text message from Renee. But as Teresa read the message, her heart sank. The text began with Renee saying how much she loved her mother and how sorry she was for the pain she was about to cause her. She wrote that if Teresa ever wanted to talk to her, she just had to call out her name and she would be there. Teresa was instantly gripped by panic. She did not fully understand what the message meant, but she knew it sounded like a goodbye. She immediately dialed Renee's number, but it went straight to voicemail. She called again and again, but there was no answer. She sent a desperate text message begging Renee to call her back, but she received no response. In a state of pure terror, Teresa called Camilla, Renee's best friend. She asked Camilla if she had heard from Renee or knew where she was. Camilla sounded shocked and told Teresa that she had actually just received a very similar frightening text message from Renee that simply said she loved her and was sorry. The two women decided they had to find her immediately. They met up and spent the next several hours driving frantically all over Sydney, checking every place they thought Renee might go. But there was no sign of her anywhere. Eventually, feeling completely helpless, they drove back to Teresa's house. By this time, Teresa's husband and Renee's siblings were all awake, gathered in the living room, waiting in agonizing silence for any news. At around 9:30 that night, there was a loud knock on the front door. Teresa ran to open it, hoping it was Renee. But instead, she was met by two police officers. The officers explained that they had found Renee's car parked in an unauthorized area, but she was not inside or anywhere near the vehicle. They had come to the family home to see if they knew where she was. When the family explained these suicidal text messages, the officers' faces grew grave. Without hesitating, Teresa and her husband ran to their car and drove straight to the location where the police had found Renee's vehicle. The car was parked in a beautiful but notorious area of Sydney known as the Gap. The Gap is a famous peninsula characterized by steep sandstone cliffs that drop directly into the churning ocean below. It is a place of incredible natural beauty, but it is also tragically well known as a site where many people go to end their lives. When the parents arrived, they rushed to Renee's car and searched it, but it was empty. They began running up and down the paved walking paths that lined the edge of the cliffs, calling out Renee's name into the dark, windy night. But there was no answer, only the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks far below. As Teresa searched, she climbed up to one of the highest lookout points on the cliff. There, on the ground, right in front of the safety fence designed to keep people away from the edge, she found something that shattered her heart. Placed neatly side by side on the gravel were Renee's flat black shoes. The police conducted an extensive search of the cliffs and the water below that night, but because of the darkness and the rough sea conditions, they could find no sign of Renee. The following day, investigators located a security camera that was positioned to monitor that specific section of the gap. They pulled the footage from the previous night and began to watch. On the video, they saw Renee. She was walking slowly up the trail, alone in the dark. She stopped near the lookout point, bent down, took off her shoes, and placed them neatly together on the ground. Then she climbed over the safety fence. The fence was set back a few feet from the actual drop-off. The footage showed Renee taking a few steps toward the sheer edge and peeking over into the abyss. She looked visibly terrified. She took a few steps backward, pressing her back flat against the safety fence. She pulled out her phone and stood there for a few moments, typing. This was the moment she sent the 3 final text messages. One was to her mother, one was to Camilla, and one was to Braden. Once the messages were sent, Renee took her phone and threw it far out over the edge, watching as it disappeared into the ocean. Then she sat down on the ground and began to shimmy herself slowly forward toward the edge of the cliff until she went out of the camera's frame. It was clear to the investigators that Renee had jumped to her death. Despite search efforts, her body was never recovered from the ocean. The family was absolutely destroyed. They could not understand how a young woman who had been planning her wedding, buying a tiara, and looking forward to her future just days before could suddenly decide to end her life. They were convinced that the key to understanding her death lay with Braden Spiteri. They believed that whatever had happened during their sudden breakup had pushed her over the edge. They tried to contact Braden, but his phone was disconnected. Desperate for answers, they contacted the police and asked them to arrange a meeting with Braden at Goulburn Prison, where he was supposedly serving his sentence. The police agreed and contacted the administration at Goulburn Prison to inquire about an inmate named Braden Spiteri. But when the prison officials checked their records, they told the police something that sent a chill down their spines. They had no record of anyone named Braden Spiteri. Not only was he not currently at the prison, but no one by that name had ever been incarcerated there. The police began a deeper investigation into this mysterious young man. They traced the phone records, the social media accounts, and the IP addresses associated with Braden Spiteri. And what they uncovered was a level of deception that was almost impossible to comprehend. Braden Spiteri did not exist. He was a completely fictitious person. And the person who had created him, the person who had been texting Renee day and night for nearly 2 years, pretending to be the love of her life, was none other than her best friend, Camilla Zaiden. The photograph that Renee had shown her mother, the one where Camilla was resting her head on Braden's shoulder, was not a photo of Camilla's ex-boyfriend. It was just a photo of a completely random guy that Camilla had met once at a nightclub and asked to take a picture with. She had used his face to create this entire elaborate lie. As the police dug deeper into the girl's history, a horrifying pattern of toxic, obsessive control began to emerge. It turned out that Camilla had been deeply, pathologically possessive of Renee ever since they met in high school. She did not want anyone else to have Renee's attention or affection. When Renee had started dating her previous boyfriend of 2 years, Camilla had grown incredibly jealous. In order to destroy that relationship and regain control over Renee, Camilla had secretly fabricated the cheating text messages. She had created fake accounts, sent those messages to herself or to Renee, and then convinced Renee that her boyfriend was a liar and a cheat. Trusting her best friend completely, Renee had broken off the relationship exactly as Camilla had planned. Then, seeing how devastated Renee was, Camilla had swooped in to play the hero. She created the persona of Braden Spiteri, a wealthy, perfect man who would heal Renee's broken heart. Camilla had spent the next 2 years living a double life. She would spend the day hanging out with Renee in person as her best friend, and then spend the night texting Renee as Braden, whispering sweet, romantic things to her through a fake phone number. But the facade began to crack in June of 2013. During an intense text conversation with Braden, Renee had opened up about her frustrations with her real-life friend, Camilla. She told Braden that Camilla had become incredibly toxic, mean, and controlling, and that she was seriously considering ending her friendship with her. On the other end of the phone, Camilla was reading these messages. She was furious. She realized that despite all her efforts to control Renee, Renee was starting to see through her and wanted to push her away. Camilla's obsession turned into a dark desire for revenge. She decided that if she could not control Renee, she would destroy her. And she would use the character of Braden to do it. On the afternoon of the 5th of August, 2013, Renee was out having lunch with a coworker. She was happy, planning her future wedding, when she suddenly received a cold, abrupt text message from Braden out of the blue saying that he needed a break from her and that it was over. Renee was completely blindsided and devastated. She tried calling him repeatedly, but the call would not go through. Desperate and confused, she decided to do something she had never done before. She called Goulburn Prison directly, hoping to speak to a guard or an administrator who could help her get in touch with Braden. The call was placed at 2:45 that afternoon. While we do not know the exact details of the conversation, it is almost certain that the prison staff informed Renee that there was no inmate named Braden Spiteri at their facility. In that single, horrifying moment, the illusion shattered. Renee would have realized that the man she had loved for 2 years, the man she was planning to marry, was a total lie. And as she began to connect the dots, she would have realized that the person behind this cruel, elaborate deception was her very best friend, Camilla. The embarrassment, the shock, and the absolute betrayal were too much for Renee's 18-year-old mind to process. She felt completely violated, foolish, and deeply broken. She could not bring herself to confess this massive, humiliating truth to her mother, who was her confidant. The weight of the realization was so heavy that she felt she could not survive it. And so, later that evening, she walked out of her house and made the tragic journey to the Gap Cliffs. When the truth finally came out, Renee's family demanded justice. They wanted Camilla to be held criminally responsible for what she had done, for driving their daughter to her death. But they were met with a harsh, frustrating reality. In Australia, as in many parts of the world at the time, there were no laws against catfishing. Creating a fake online persona and using it to deceive someone, even if it leads to devastating psychological harm, was not considered a criminal offense. Because Camilla had not physically forced Renee to jump, she could not be charged with any crime related to her death. Throughout the inquest and the media coverage that followed, Camilla refused to take any responsibility for what happened. She never apologized to Renee's family, and she never showed any remorse for the incredible devastation she had caused. Today, Renee's family is left with a profound, lingering grief and a sense of anger that may never truly fade. They are forced to live with the knowledge that the person who destroyed their daughter's life is walking free, completely unpunished by the law. The story of Renee Marsden is a haunting reminder of the dark side of our connected world. It shows us that the people we think we know, the people we let into our lives and our hearts, can sometimes be the very ones who are plotting our destruction. And it leaves us with the unsettling truth that sometimes the most horrific acts of cruelty can be committed without ever breaking a single law on the books. These 3 stories, from the miraculous reunion of Michael and Lisa, to the bloody, corrupt empire of Wallace Sousa, and finally to the tragic digital betrayal of Renee Marsden, show us the incredible spectrum of human behavior. They remind us of the power of our actions, the weight of the choices we make, and the enduring, sometimes devastating consequences that follow them. And the 3rd story is the one that people still debate to this day. Because depending on your perspective, it might not even be considered a crime. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you're not ready to stop, there's another story waiting for you right now. In 2006, a young woman named Heather Kwan was living in the small town of Desert Hills, Arizona. She was 21 years old, a college student with a future that looked incredibly bright. From the time she was a little girl, Heather had this amazing capacity for empathy. She was the kind of person who was drawn to people who were hurting, the ones who felt overlooked or left behind by society. It was a core part of who she was. This wasn't just a feeling she had, she put it into action. As a teenager and into her early 20s, she would spend her weekends volunteering her time with underprivileged children. She saw the potential in them and wanted to help them see it in themselves. Her big dream was to go to law school, but she didn't want to be a prosecutor or a corporate lawyer. She wanted to be a defense attorney. She loved the idea of professionally fighting for people who desperately needed someone in their corner. It was a perfect fit for her personality. Heather lived in a rental home with her boyfriend, an 18-year-old named Ryan Waller. Ryan was also a student, and he was known for being a pretty big gun enthusiast. The two of them had a life together, making plans and looking towards the future. That year, as the holidays approached, Heather and Ryan made plans to spend Christmas Day with Ryan's father, Don. They were expected to be at his house on December 25th for Christmas dinner. Don had prepared a meal and was waiting for them to arrive. But as the day wore on, they never showed up. Don started to get worried. This was completely out of character for them. They weren't the type to just blow off a holiday celebration without so much as a phone call. He tried calling both of their cell phones again and again, but there was no answer. A deep sense of unease settled in his stomach. He just knew something was wrong. Instead of driving over to their house himself, Don decided the best course of action was to call the local police and ask them to perform a welfare check. He just wanted to know that they were both okay. A short time later, police officers arrived at the couple's home in Desert Hills. They walked up to the front door and knocked, the sound echoing in the quiet neighborhood. There was no answer. They waited a moment, then knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. They decided to take a look around the property. They peered through the windows. A few lights were on inside, casting a dim glow, but the house was mostly dark and silent. A car was parked in the driveway, but they couldn't be sure if it belonged to Heather and Ryan or someone else. The officers stood on the porch for a moment, listening. There was no movement inside, no sounds of a television or conversation. They knocked a third time, and this time they announced their presence. They called out, "Police Department! We're here for a welfare check on Ryan and Heather. We just need to make sure you're both all right." For a few seconds, there was only silence. The officers exchanged a look, probably thinking they'd have to find another way in. But then they heard a sound from inside the house. It was the distinct click of a deadbolt being unlocked. The door slowly swung inward, and standing in the doorway was Ryan. The first thing the officers noticed was his face. He had a massive dark bruise completely surrounding his left eye, a classic black eye. There was also a fresh cut across the bridge of his nose. He just stood there, staring at them with a blank expression. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask why they were there. He just looked at them. The officers looked past Ryan, trying to see into the dimly lit house. That's when they saw a woman lying on the living room couch. They assumed this must be Heather. They turned their attention back to Ryan and asked him what happened to his eye. Ryan's response was strange. He seemed sluggish and evasive. He didn't give them a straight answer, just mumbled something about not knowing what had happened. The police didn't push him on it too hard at that moment. They assessed him, and despite the obvious injury and his odd demeanor, they figured he was more or less okay. Their next question was about the woman on the couch. One of the officers asked, "Is that Heather?" Again, Ryan was weirdly dismissive. He glanced back towards the couch and said something like, "Oh, her? She's just sleeping." The officers explained why they were there. They told him, "Look, your father called us. He's worried about you two. We're here on a welfare check, so we have to go inside and wake her up to make sure she's actually okay. Ryan's reaction was defensive. He didn't immediately move out of the way. He seemed almost agitated by their request, but he didn't put up a real fight. After a moment of hesitation, he finally stepped aside, and the police entered the home. They walked straight over to the couch where Heather was lying. And as soon as they looked down at her, they knew instantly that she was not asleep. Heather Kwan was dead. It was clear she had been deceased for at least a couple of days. They could see she had died from a single gunshot wound to her head. The scene changed in an instant. This was no longer a welfare check. It was a homicide investigation. Ryan was immediately placed under arrest. He didn't resist. He didn't fight them. But as they put the cuffs on him, he kept saying emphatically that he didn't know what was going on. He was confused, he didn't understand what was happening, and he had no idea what had happened to Heather. Despite his protests, he was taken out of the house and placed in the back of a squad car. And there he sat. For hours. As more and more police units and paramedics descended on the house, Ryan just waited in the back of that car. The crime scene was processed, and Heather's body was carefully removed and transported to the morgue. Finally, at around 5 in the morning on December 26th, after sitting in that car for the better part of the night, Ryan was driven to the Phoenix police station for questioning. The interrogation that was about to take place was all recorded on video. It would start off like any other police interview, but it would soon spiral into one of the most bizarre and unsettling exchanges imaginable. And at the very end of it, a single stunning revelation would change everything. When you see the clips from this interrogation, and you eventually hear the revelation, it's worth going back and re-watching his behavior. It casts everything he says and does in a completely different light. The video begins at 5:08 a.m. on December 26th. Ryan is led into a small, plain interrogation room. He's wearing a white jumpsuit. It's unclear if it was issued by the police or if it was his own, but it looks like standard jail attire. He has no shoes or socks on. His hands are not cuffed. He walks into the room and sits down in a chair tucked into a back corner. The chair is next to a small table, and on the other side of that table is another empty chair. Ryan sits down, facing the middle of the room. He's quiet, almost motionless. He just sits there, staring into space. After a moment, he seems to notice a single handcuff that's attached to a metal bar on the table. In many interrogations, a suspect would be cuffed to this table. But Ryan had been brought in uncuffed. He had received no instructions from the officers to secure himself. But for some reason, he picks up the handcuff and fastens it around his own wrist. He is now tethered to the table by his own choice. After handcuffing himself, Ryan leans forward, puts his arms on the table, and rests his head in his arms. He stays like this for about 5 minutes. Every so often, he lets out a low groaning sound, but mostly he's just silent and still. Then, without any warning, he makes a much louder moaning sound and suddenly stands up as if he's decided to just walk out of the room. But as he takes a step, the handcuff he put on himself pulls him up short. He's stuck. He looks down at the cuff, seemingly confused about why he can't move, but he doesn't dwell on it. Instead, he just reaches across the table, grabs a blank piece of paper that's sitting there, and then sits back down. He crosses his legs and just starts staring at the empty sheet of paper. At 5:17 a.m., about 9 minutes after being left alone in the room, the door opens and a detective walks in. This detective's name was Dalton. He tells Ryan that they need to take pictures of his feet, and he instructs him to put his feet up on the table next to him. Ryan seems confused by the request, not really understanding what's happening, but he complies. He lifts his bare feet and places them on the table. Just then, another officer comes into the room carrying a camera and a forensic kit. This second officer then begins a slow, methodical 10-minute process of photographing and swabbing Ryan's feet. During these 10 minutes, Detective Dalton stays in the room with Ryan. Every now and then, Ryan would ask if he could just leave and go home. He seemed completely oblivious to the gravity of his situation. When Dalton would tell him no, that he couldn't leave, Ryan would get frustrated and upset, almost like a child being told they can't have a toy. His reactions were not what you would expect from a murder suspect. At 5:28 a.m., the forensic officer finishes up, packs his kit, and leaves the room. Dalton closes the door behind him, walks back to the table, and pulls the empty chair out, so he's sitting closer to Ryan. He introduces himself and then begins with some very basic questions. He asks Ryan to confirm his name, which he does. He asks for his date of birth and his social security number. Ryan provides both. Then Dalton asks the big question, "Do you know why you're here?" And Ryan just says, "No." At this point, Dalton decides to formalize the interview. He says, "Okay, let's just stop for a second. I'm going to read you your rights." And it's at this moment that Ryan's behavior goes from being just strange to being deeply, deeply bizarre. When Dalton says he needs to read him his rights, Ryan just stares at him with a blank look. He doesn't seem to process what the words mean. Dalton seems to notice this lack of comprehension, so he tries to make it a little more relatable. He says, "Hey Ryan, I'm going to read you your rights, just like they do on TV. Like on Cops, or Law and Order, or CSI. You've seen those shows, right?" Ryan's response is a simple, flat no. Dalton is a bit taken aback. He asks, "You've never seen a cop show where they read people their rights?" At this, Ryan's demeanor suddenly shifts. The robotic blankness is gone, replaced by a defensive look. He quickly changes his answer. "Oh yeah, I have." Yeah. It was obvious to Dalton that Ryan was lying about something completely insignificant. It didn't matter one bit whether he'd seen a crime show on television. There was a weird, tense silence in the room for a moment. It seemed like Dalton knew he was lying, and Ryan just looked confused. But Dalton decides not to press the issue. He just moves on and reads Ryan his Miranda rights. After he's done, he gets back to the basic questions. His next one is, "Hey Ryan, what was the highest grade you completed in school?" Ryan isn't looking at Dalton anymore. He's staring off to the side of the room, that blank expression back on his face. When asked the question, he just says, "I don't know." Dalton is incredulous. "You don't know what grade you finished in school?" Ryan says, "No, I don't know." Then, after a pause, he adds, eighth grade? Just like before, he's changed his answer abruptly as soon as he's challenged. Dalton is probably thinking that this is another lie, but again, it's such a small, pointless thing to lie about. But a pattern is starting to form. It's becoming hard for the detective to trust anything Ryan says when he can't even be truthful about things that have no bearing on the case. But Dalton keeps going. He asks a follow-up question based on Ryan's claim of an 8th grade education. He says, "Okay, so did you get your GED?" A GED is a high school equivalency diploma. If Ryan only finished 8th grade, he wouldn't have graduated high school, so it was a logical next question. The answer should be a simple yes or no. But Ryan's answer was anything but simple. It was contradictory and weird, and it started to paint a picture of someone who was just not processing reality correctly. Dalton asks him, "Do you have a GED?" Ryan says, "I don't know." The detective presses, "You don't know what?" And Ryan just repeats, "I don't know." "I don't know? I just want to go home." Dalton tells him he's not going home right now, and then circles back. "What's the highest grade that you completed?" And Ryan answers, B. Clearly confused, Dalton clarifies, "No, not a letter grade." "I'm asking, did you graduate high school?" Ryan says, "No." Dalton confirms, "And the highest you went was 8th grade." Ryan says, "Yep." Finally, Dalton asks, "Do you know how to read and write, Ryan?" And Ryan says, "Yeah." The conversation about his education has gone absolutely nowhere. Dalton, again, chooses not to get bogged down in the inconsistencies and just moves the interrogation forward. He starts asking about Heather. He begins by asking Ryan if he has a girlfriend. Now, Dalton already knows the answer to this. The initial welfare check was for Ryan and his girlfriend, Heather. Don Waller would have told the dispatcher they were a couple. So Dalton knows they're in a relationship, but he wants to hear it from Ryan. He asks, "Do you have a girlfriend?" And Ryan says no. It's a clear lie. Dalton goes along with it and rephrases. "Okay, well, do you know a girl named Heather?" Ryan says, "Yes, I do." But when he starts to describe Heather, his description is completely wrong. He says Heather is a 16 or 17-year-old girl, even though she was actually 21. He says he thinks her last name is Kimmin, but he's not sure. He says she uses different nicknames and names, but he believes it's Kimmin. Her actual last name was Kwan. Dalton is aware of all these discrepancies, but he just keeps the questions coming. He changes the subject back to Ryan's injury. He asks, "What happened to your face? You've got that huge bruise. What happened?" At first, Ryan says he doesn't know. But Dalton keeps pressing him, asking again and again how he got the bruise on his face. And eventually Ryan starts to talk. He tells the detective, "I don't know. I think it was Heather." He says it was an accident, that he forgets why she hit him. For Dalton and for the other officers, this was a confession. Their theory from the beginning was that Ryan had killed Heather. They believed the bruise on his face was from Heather fighting for her life before he murdered her. So, when Ryan says the mark on his face is from Heather, even though he claims it was an accident, to Detective Dalton, it was the same as him saying, "I killed her." Dalton tries to get more specific details about the fight that he believes took place between Ryan and Heather. But as he pushes for more information, his tone becomes more aggressive. Ryan seems to pick up on this and becomes very defensive. He starts throwing out random pieces of information, and most of it sounds completely made up. He suggests that there were 2 or 3 other people in the house on the night Heather was killed. But it's unclear if these people were even real. It just seemed like Ryan was panicking and was just saying anything that came into his head. At a certain point, Dalton feels like the interview is spiraling out of control. He decides he needs to refocus the conversation. He just stops Ryan mid-sentence and says, "Ryan, there is a dead girl in your house, and I need information." He looks him straight in the eye and says, "There's a dead girl in your living room." And Ryan asks, "She's dead?" Dalton says, "Yes." Ryan then asks, "Heather?" Dalton says he doesn't know. He just knows the girl on the couch is dead, and he needs to know what happened. The interesting thing about this moment is Ryan's reaction. When he's told for the first time in the interrogation that there's a dead girl in his house, he reacts with what looks like genuine, absolute surprise. It's the only time during the entire interview from start to finish where Ryan's posture changes. He sits forward in his chair. He perks up. For a brief moment, he seems relatively normal. He's not acting confused or bizarre. He looks dialed in, as if this is the first time he's hearing this information, and it has shocked him to his core. But just as quickly as it appears, that moment of clarity is gone. Just seconds after sitting forward and seeming engaged, he slumps back into his bizarre, detached state. And now, he suddenly has a very elaborate story about what happened to Heather, even though just a moment ago, he seemed to have no idea she was even dead. It made no sense that he would have a story so ready to go for something he seemed to know nothing about. And of course, just like all his other answers, the story he tells is filled with contradictions and impossible details. He says, "These people came over, and his dad, with shoot and arrow, bow and darts." "You know what I'm talking about?" Dalton says, "Yeah." Ryan continues, "They hit me and her with those." That's it. Dalton clarifies, "They hit you?" Ryan says, "Yeah." Dalton says, "Now it's Richie that hit you, not Heather." Ryan says, "No, Richie and his dad." So now the story is that two men, Richie and his father, came to the house and attacked them. Dalton asks why they would do that. Ryan says they were trying to get their stuff, but he doesn't know why. He then says they had some kind of bow and arrows. Then he says they each had 2 revolvers. Dalton points out the contradiction. You just said they had bow and arrows. Now they have revolvers. Ryan says, that's what I meant. They have revolvers. Dalton asks what happened then. Ryan says, then they shot us with those. After this, Ryan changes his story yet again. He says, actually, they didn't shoot me. They just shot Heather. They put me in a sleeper hold. But when Dalton asks him what a sleeper hold is, Ryan says he doesn't know. Then, just as quickly, he ditches the sleeper hold story and goes back to the previous version. Richie and his father came in and shot both of them. At this point, Ryan's story is so convoluted and has changed so many times that it's just completely unbelievable. Dalton, who had been trying his best to follow along, can't even pretend anymore. It just doesn't make any sense. He tells Ryan, you're all over the board here. First you're saying bows and arrows, then revolvers. You're saying they shot you in the eye. With a revolver? Ryan says, yes. Dalton tells him, you wouldn't be talking to me right now. You'd most likely be dead. Ryan says, that's what I thought too, man. I really don't know. Dalton tries to piece the story together. So you got shot first? Ryan says yes. What happened? Did you fall to the ground? Ryan says, yeah, he was trying to get up, but he couldn't. And then she got shot? Ryan says yes. What did you do? Did you call 911? Did you check if she was alive? And Ryan gives the most chilling answer yet. He says she was sleeping still, and that's it. I just let her sleep. Dalton is stunned. She got shot in the side of the face and you let her sleep? Ryan just says, yes. Dalton finally loses his patience. This does not make sense, Ryan. After this exchange, the detective goes full bad cop. He openly and repeatedly accuses Ryan of shooting and killing Heather. But Ryan just continues to deny it, saying he doesn't know anything, that he didn't do it. His answers remain nonsensical and contradictory. Nothing is adding up. Finally, at 5:52 a.m., after nearly 45 minutes of this, Dalton is at a complete loss. He doesn't know how to handle Ryan. He firmly believes Ryan is guilty, but nothing Ryan has said is a credible confession. Nothing he has said makes any logical sense at all. The detective is just sitting there trying to figure out his next move. And then he notices something. He sees something on Ryan's face, near his nose. He tells Ryan to come closer, that he needs to get a better look. He says, let me see your nose. Put your legs down. Bring your face closer. Ryan complains that his head hurts, but he leans forward. Dalton looks closely at his face. And that's when he saw it. What Detective Dalton had finally discovered after hours of treating Ryan as a suspect were bullet holes. There were 4 of them in Ryan's face and head. Ryan hadn't committed a crime. He was a victim, just like Heather. The only difference was that somehow, against all odds, Ryan had survived the attack. The real story had happened 2 days before that welfare check on December 23rd. 2 men had broken into Ryan and Heather's house. They were 23-year-old Richie Carver and his 54-year-old father, Larry Carver. The very same Richie and Richie's father that Ryan had been talking about during his confused interrogation. They were at the house for revenge. About a month earlier, Richie had been living with Ryan and Heather, but he started making unwanted advances toward Heather. She told Ryan, who became furious. The 2 men got into a huge fight, and Ryan kicked Richie out of the house. Richie was humiliated and enraged, and he began to plot his revenge. On December 23rd, he and his father went to the house to carry it out. They went to the back of the house, and Ryan saw them through a glass door near the kitchen. He ran to the door to try and hold it shut to stop them from getting inside. But Richie and Larry managed to force the door open just enough for Richie to stick his hand and the gun he was holding inside. He shot Ryan point blank twice in the face. The first bullet entered through his nose, passed through his nasal cavity, and exited the other side of his nose. That bullet then re-entered his head, going through his left eye socket and lodging deep inside his brain. The impact also broke off 6 fragments of his skull, which were pushed into his brain along with the bullet. That single shot created 3 of the bullet holes. The second bullet that was fired hit the side of Ryan's head. It didn't penetrate his skull, so the bullet itself didn't enter his brain, but it hit with enough force to fracture his skull, creating a 4th bullet hole. Ryan immediately dropped to the ground unconscious. The Carvers assumed he was dead. They forced the door the rest of the way open, stepped over Ryan's body, and walked into the living room. There, they found Heather cowering on the sofa. Richie walked right up to her, put the gun to her head, and fired a single shot. After she fell, the 2 men stole a few items from the house and then fled. They were eventually caught, and both are now serving life sentences for their crimes. It's believed that Heather died instantly. But Ryan didn't. At some point, maybe a few hours after being shot, he regained consciousness. But he had suffered catastrophic brain damage. He wouldn't have known what was happening. He didn't know what had just transpired. He saw his girlfriend, Heather, lying on the couch, and in his damaged mind, he simply thought she was asleep. So he went to his bedroom and fell asleep himself. The next morning, December 24th, he woke up. He still had no idea what was going on. He spent the entire day just wandering around his house, confused and in pain, while his girlfriend lay dead on the couch in the other room. After a full day of this mindless confusion, he went back to bed. He woke up on Christmas Day, December 25th, and spent another full day in the same state, just wandering around the house, believing Heather was simply in a deep sleep. And then, the welfare check was called in. When the police arrived and saw Ryan's bruised face and strange behavior, they jumped to the most obvious conclusion that he had killed Heather. And this assumption dictated every action they took from that moment on. If they had considered for a second that he might also be a victim, they would have sought immediate medical attention for the very visible wound on his face. But they didn't. They saw the bruise as evidence of her fighting back before he killed her. So they gave him no medical care at all. Instead, he was put in the back of that police car, where he sat for 6 hours with no medical intervention. And during every single one of those hours, the bleeding and swelling inside his head were causing more and more irreversible brain damage. The clock had been ticking from the moment they found him, and for hours they let it tick away. After the long wait, he was taken to the police station. And again, no one gave him any medical care. He was put straight into an interrogation room where he was questioned for nearly 2 more hours, even though he had 4 bullet holes on his face that no one seemed to notice or take seriously. Every second that passed, his brain was being further destroyed. And then finally, at the end of that torturous interrogation, Detective Dalton, probably thinking to himself that something was seriously wrong with this guy, stepped back from trying to get a confession. He looked at him not as a killer, but as a person. And that's when he finally saw the holes in his face and realized a terrible, terrible mistake had been made. He immediately called for an ambulance. When the fire department paramedics arrived in the interrogation room, you could hear the disbelief in their voices as the situation was explained to them. One of them said to the other, "You're not going to believe this one." They noted the possible entrance and exit wounds and that Ryan was acting like he had a serious head injury, which, of course, made perfect sense. Ryan was rushed to the hospital for emergency surgery. The surgeons were able to save his life, but it came at a devastating cost. They had to remove a large portion of his brain to relieve the pressure, and they also had to remove his left eye. Some reports say both of his eyes were removed. Regardless, after the surgery, Ryan was no longer the same person. The brain damage was so extensive that he could no longer live independently. He couldn't take care of himself. He had to move back in with his parents, who became his full-time caregivers for the rest of his life. 10 years later, Ryan died from a seizure that was a direct result of the injuries he sustained in that attack. His death was also directly connected to the critical lack of medical care he received in those first 8 hours after police found him. In the wake of this public mishandling of the case, the Phoenix Police Department conducted an internal investigation. However, no one was ever disciplined, at least not publicly. As for Ryan's family, they would have had a strong case for a lawsuit against the police department, but they chose not to file one. They said, "The only thing we want is our son back, and a lawsuit will not give us that." Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Think about the choices you make every single day. Most of them feel completely minor. You choose what to eat for breakfast, which route to take to work, or whether to say hello to a stranger. You do not spend hours agonizing over these decisions because they seem totally harmless. But life has a very strange way of working. Sometimes, the smallest, most insignificant choice you make can set off a massive chain reaction. A single moment can ripple outward and completely reshape your entire future, or even the lives of millions of other people around the globe. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible stories of real people who made simple choices that led to some of the most famous, unexpected turning points in modern history. And as you will see, none of them could have possibly guessed where their actions would lead. Our first story begins on a cold morning on the 17th of January, 1977. A 36-year-old man named Gary Gilmore was walking slowly across a yard towards an old abandoned canned food factory in Draper, Utah. He was not alone. In fact, Gary was surrounded by several heavily armed prison guards. The guards were tense. They kept their hands close to their weapons because they were terrified that Gary might try to make a run for it. They thought he might break away and force them to shoot him right there in the yard. But the truth was, Gary had absolutely no intention of running. He had been waiting for this exact moment for months, and he was completely ready. So, Gary kept walking, his boots crunching on the cold ground, flanked by the guards. He did not hesitate for a single second when they reached the entrance of the concrete building. He just stepped inside. The interior of the old factory was massive, cold, and completely empty. There was no machinery left, no boxes, nothing. It was just a giant, cavernous space with concrete floors and high ceilings. But way across the room, pushed up against the far back wall, sat a single wooden chair. Gary did not need to be told what to do. He immediately began walking across the empty concrete floor directly toward that chair. When he reached it, he turned around and sat down. As soon as he was seated, the guards moved in quickly. They took thick leather straps and began securing his wrists and his ankles to the wooden chair so he could not move at all. Throughout this entire process, Gary did not struggle. He did not say a word. He did not even look at the guards. Instead, his eyes were locked on the opposite side of the empty room. On the far wall, directly across from where Gary was strapped down, was a large, heavy black curtain. It looked like someone had wheeled out a stage curtain to block the view of whatever was behind it. And as Gary stared at this curtain, he noticed there were 5 small, evenly spaced slots cut into the fabric. Gary could not see through those dark slots, but he knew exactly what was behind them. He knew that at each of those 5 stations, a police officer was standing with a loaded rifle. They were the firing squad, and they were there because Gary himself had specifically requested them. To understand how Gary ended up in this chair, we have to go back to the summer of 1976. Gary was a troubled man who had spent most of his adult life in and out of reform schools and prisons for various crimes. But in July of 1976, his behavior turned incredibly violent. Over the course of just 2 days, Gary robbed and murdered two innocent young men in Utah. First, he shot Max Jensen, a gas station attendant who complied with all of his demands. The very next night, he shot Benny Bushnell, a student working at a motel. Both men did exactly what Gary asked, but he killed them anyway. Gary was caught almost immediately, put on trial, and convicted of murder. In October of 1976, the jury sentenced him to death. Now, at the time, this was a massive deal. The United States had not executed anyone in nearly 10 years due to a Supreme Court ruling on the death penalty. Gary's case was going to be the first execution in a decade, and it sparked a huge media storm. Almost immediately, people stepped in to try and stop it. Gary's own mother, along with organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union, filed multiple appeals to try and get his sentence changed to life in prison. But while most death row inmates would have been grateful for the help, Gary was furious. He did not want to spend the rest of his life locked in a concrete box. He believed that life without parole was a fate far worse than death. And so, Gary fought against his own lawyers. He pushed the courts to go ahead with the execution as quickly as possible. Under Utah law at the time, death row inmates were allowed to choose how they wanted to die. They could choose hanging, or they could choose a firing squad. Gary chose the firing squad. And so, after months of legal battles, his request was finally granted. Now, back in the abandoned cannery, the guards finished tightening the leather straps on Gary's wrists and ankles. They stepped away, leaving him alone in the chair. Then, a prison chaplain walked over. He stood beside Gary and read him his last rites. When he finished, the chaplain looked down at Gary and asked him if he had any final words he wanted to share with the world. Gary did not hesitate. He looked up at the chaplain, completely calm, and simply said, "Let's do it." The chaplain nodded, stepped back, and signaled to the men behind the curtain. 5 rifle barrels poked through these small slots in the black fabric. A moment later, a loud blast echoed through the cavernous room, and Gary Gilmore was dead. At this point, you might be wondering how this dark story has anything to do with a small choice changing the world. Well, we have to fast forward 10 years to the year 1987. In Portland, Oregon, a young marketing executive named Dan Whedon was sitting in a conference room at his advertising agency, Whedon and Kennedy. Dan and his team had recently signed a new client. It was a sports shoe company that had a lot of potential, but they were struggling. They were trying desperately to compete with Reebok, which was absolutely dominating the fitness market at the time. This shoe company had hired Dan to create a massive breakthrough marketing campaign that would help them stand out and become a household name. But the problem was, Dan and his team were completely stuck. For hours, they sat in that meeting room, tossing around different ideas and pitches. They wanted something that would connect with serious, hardcore athletes, but also with ordinary people who were just trying to get off the couch and go for a jog. Every idea they came up with felt flat. Nothing had that punch they needed. Dan was getting more and more frustrated as the hours ticked by. And then, completely out of nowhere, Dan had a sudden epiphany. He was not even sure why the thought entered his mind, but he suddenly found himself thinking about the execution of Gary Gilmore from 10 years earlier. Like millions of other Americans, Dan had watched the news coverage of the execution back in 1977. And for some strange reason, as he sat in that frustrating meeting, he remembered the very last words Gary had spoken right before the rifles fired. Dan thought about the phrase, "Let's do it." It was incredibly simple. It was direct, and it possessed a strange, rugged determination. It was about taking action without overthinking, without making excuses. But Dan thought the phrase could be just a little bit stronger. He decided to tweak it slightly to make it sound more universal. He changed the word "let's" to the word "just." And so, the phrase became, "Just do it." Dan pitched the 3-word slogan to his client, which was Nike. At first, the executives at Nike actually hated it. Phil Knight, the co-founder of the company, thought it was a terrible idea and a waste of money. But Dan convinced them to trust his instinct and run with it. In 1988, Nike launched their first commercial featuring the new slogan showing an 80-year-old man running across the Golden Gate Bridge. The campaign was an overnight sensation. The slogan resonated deeply with people all over the world. Within just a few years, Nike's sales skyrocketed, doubling their business and turning them into the multi-billion-dollar global empire they are today. All because a creative director in Oregon randomly remembered the final words of a convicted killer facing a firing squad. Our second story takes us to the city of London in the year 2009. A 23-year-old aspiring actor named Chris was walking down a busy street on his way to a date. Chris was incredibly stressed out. He had very little money in his bank account, and he was struggling to pay his rent. He desperately needed a big break, and he was hoping that his luck was about to change because the very next morning he had an incredibly important job interview. But for tonight, Chris had to focus on his date. He wanted to make a good impression, but his empty wallet made things very difficult. He could not afford a fancy restaurant or a nice bar. And so, as they walked through the chilly London air, Chris made a choice. He decided to take his date into a local McDonald's. Now, this McDonald's was not a romantic spot. It was extremely loud, the floors were sticky, and it was absolutely packed with people who had been out drinking. But it was the only thing Chris could afford. He looked at his date, feeling a bit embarrassed, and asked if this was okay. She was incredibly understanding. She just smiled, told him it was perfectly fine, and they got in line to order. After they got their food, they turned around to find a place to sit. But the restaurant was so crowded that every single table was completely full. Chris and his date began walking through the dining area, looking for any open spot. Finally, Chris spotted a table where a single man was sitting by himself. The man was quiet, minding his own business, and eating his meal. Crucially, there were 2 empty chairs at his table. Chris walked over, trying to be as polite as possible, and asked the man if they could sit in the empty chairs. He promised they would not bother him and would leave as soon as they finished eating. The man looked up, shrugged, and told them to go ahead. Chris and his date sat down, and they began to eat and talk. But the problem was, Chris was incredibly distracted. His mind kept drifting to the massive job interview he had scheduled for the next morning. He was so anxious about it that he was barely paying attention to the conversation. He just wanted to finish his food, walk his date home, and go to bed so he could be fully rested and focused for the interview. As Chris sat there lost in his thoughts, he suddenly realized that the atmosphere at the table had completely changed. The man sitting across from them had stopped eating. He had turned his head and was now staring directly at Chris's date. The look on his face was not friendly at all. It was aggressive and intensely uncomfortable. Before Chris could even ask what was going on, the stranger opened his mouth and began hurling incredibly cruel insults at Chris's date. He started making fun of the way she looked and the way she talked. Chris was stunned. He looked at his date, then back at the man, trying to understand why this stranger was suddenly attacking them out of nowhere. But the man did not stop. He looked directly at the young woman and called her an ugly pig. Now, Chris had never been in a physical fight in his entire life. He was a gentle guy, and he hated violence. On top of that, Chris was not a particularly large man. He stood at about 5 feet, 8 inches tall. But hearing this stranger brutally insult his date was more than he could take. He decided he had to stand up for her. Chris stood up from his chair, looked at the man, and told him to get up. But as soon as the stranger stood up, Chris realized he had made a massive mistake. The man was an absolute giant. He towered over Chris, blocking out the bright fluorescent lights of the restaurant. But Chris knew he could not back down now. He took a deep breath, wound up his fist, and punched the giant man right in the face. It did not go well. The punch barely registered, and the massive stranger immediately proceeded to beat the living crap out of Chris right there in the middle of the crowded McDonald's. He threw Chris to the ground, hitting him repeatedly while the other customers watched in shock. By the time the giant finally stopped and wandered out of the restaurant into the night, Chris was bruised, bleeding, and utterly humiliated. Chris and his date left the restaurant immediately. Chris kept apologizing over and over again, feeling like a complete failure. His date tried to reassure him, but they were both incredibly shaken up. They went their separate ways, and Chris went home, crawling into bed with his body aching. The next morning, Chris woke up early. He walked into his bathroom, looked in the mirror, and gasped. His face was a total mess. He had a massive, swollen black eye, and his jaw was deeply bruised. He looked like he had just escaped a war zone. Chris felt a wave of pure panic. He was supposed to walk into a high-end professional job interview in just a couple of hours. He wondered if he should just call and cancel. How could anyone take him seriously when he looked like a street brawler? But Chris knew this was the biggest opportunity of his career. He decided he could not let his fear ruin his chances. He put on his best suit, walked out the door, and headed to the interview. When he arrived at the office, he was escorted into a room with the interviewers. As soon as he walked in, he could feel their eyes lock onto his massive black eye. It was incredibly awkward. Nobody asked him about it, and Chris did not want to explain that he had gotten beaten up at a McDonald's the night before. He just tried to remain confident, deliver his lines, and ignore the physical pain in his face. By the end of the meeting, Chris was convinced he had completely blown it. He thanked them for their time and left the building, assuming he would never hear from them again. But a few days later, Chris received a phone call that would change his life forever. It turned out that the interviewers did not hate his black eye at all. In fact, they absolutely loved it. You see, the job Chris was interviewing for was not an office job. It was an audition for a starring role in a massive new fantasy television series. The character they were casting was a gritty, battle-hardened young warrior who constantly found himself in dangerous, violent situations. When Chris had walked into the room looking like he had just been in a real fistfight, the casting directors realized they did not need to use makeup to make him look tough. He looked completely authentic, rugged, and real. They offered Chris the role on the spot. That television show was Game of Thrones, and Chris was cast as the legendary character Jon Snow. Today, the world knows him by his stage name, Kit Harington. He went from being a broke, young actor who could barely afford a cheap meal to a global superstar nominated for multiple Emmy and Globe Awards. All because he made the brave, impulsive choice to stand up to a giant in a London McDonald's. Our third story takes us back to the year 1925, to the campus of Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. A 21-year-old college senior named Ted was sitting inside his dorm room surrounded by his closest friends. The group had managed to get their hands on a bottle of gin, and they were busy pouring drinks and celebrating. Now, to understand the gravity of this situation, we have to remember the time period. In 1925, the United States was in the middle of Prohibition. The law made the manufacture and consumption of alcohol completely illegal. It did not matter that they were 21 years old. Having that bottle of gin in their dorm room was a serious crime that could result in arrest. But Ted was willing to take the risk because he had so much to celebrate. He was a brilliant senior who was about to graduate with high honors. More importantly, he had just been named the editor-in-chief of Dartmouth's humor magazine, The Jack-O-Lantern. For Ted, this was a massive deal. He had dreams of becoming a professional writer and cartoonist. Being the editor was the perfect stepping stone to a successful career. So, feeling incredibly happy and successful, Ted took a drink and passed the bottle around. But as the night went on and they got louder, they suddenly heard a loud knock on the door. The room went silent. Ted got up, opened the door, and his heart sank. Standing in the hallway were 2 police officers and the college dean. Ted and his friends were caught red-handed. Fortunately, the police decided not to press criminal charges, so nobody went to jail. The school also decided not to expel Ted or his friends, allowing them to graduate. But the school still handed down a severe punishment. Dartmouth stripped Ted of his academic honors and forced him to step down from his position as editor-in-chief of the Jack-O-Lantern. To make matters worse, the dean decreed that he was completely banned from submitting any writing or drawings to the magazine. Ted was devastated. Losing the position felt like his entire future was being ripped away. He spent days in his room wondering how he would ever get his career off the ground if he could not even publish his work in a college paper. At first, Ted thought about pleading with the dean to lift the ban. But he knew the administration was incredibly strict, and they were definitely not going to change their minds. He was completely stuck. But then, Ted had a brilliant idea. He realized that while he was banned from submitting work under his own name, the magazine's staff still accepted submissions from the general public. They did not always verify the identity of the people sending in cartoons. So, Ted made a clever choice. He decided to create a secret identity, a pen name. He drew a series of new cartoons and signed them with a completely different name. He decided to use his middle name, which was his mother's maiden name. The name he chose was Seuss. Ted quietly submitted his drawings to the magazine under his new pseudonym. The new editorial staff at the Jack-o'-lantern had absolutely no idea that the submissions were coming from the banned former editor. They looked at the drawings, fell in love with the unique, whimsical art style, and immediately published them. Ted was thrilled. Not only was he able to keep doing what he loved, but he actually found a strange sense of freedom in writing and drawing under a fake name. It allowed him to be more creative and playful than ever before. He kept up the ruse for the rest of his senior year, graduating without the school ever finding out. And after graduation, when Ted decided to pursue writing and illustrating full-time, he chose to keep using that very same pen name. He added the prefix Doctor to the beginning of it, partly as a joke because his father had always wanted him to go to medical school and become a doctor. Over the course of his long and legendary career, Ted would write and illustrate over 60 books under his famous pen name. His stories would capture the imaginations of hundreds of millions of children and adults all over the world, teaching generations of kids how to read and winning him a Pulitzer Prize. Ted's full name was Theodore Geisel, but the entire world knows him simply as Dr. Seuss. All because a college senior decided to share a bottle of gin with his friends on a quiet night in 1925, got caught, and had to find a creative way to beat the system. It is truly mind-blowing to think about how these lives were fully reshaped by moments that seemed so small. A desperate man facing a firing squad speaks 3 words that become the face of a giant sports empire. A young actor gets into a violent restaurant fight and walks away with the role of a legendary hero. A college kid gets caught with a bottle of illegal gin and ends up creating a famous pen name. We are all always just one small, unexpected choice away from a completely different destiny. Did these stories make you realize how one small decision can change everything? Or are you ready for what comes next? Strongsville, Ohio used to be one of those quiet, comfortable suburbs you see all over America. A place with nice homes, nice families, and a local mall. But in late 2017, something was discovered there that put the town on the map for all the wrong reasons. And to really understand what happened, we need to go back to early 2016, which is when this town's long nightmare really began. In early 2016, a couple named Bruce and Melinda Pleskovich, who had lived in Strongsville for a long time, got some very exciting news. Their 20-year-old daughter Anna and her 20-year-old fiancé, a young man named Jeff, had just told them they were expecting a baby. It was going to be a little girl. And so, Bruce and Melinda were absolutely thrilled. They were finally going to be grandparents. But at the same time, they were a little worried. They knew that Anna and Jeff didn't have a lot of money. Anna was still living at home with her parents. She had a job as a waitress at the local Applebee's, but it didn't pay much. And as for Jeff, he had a decent job. He was a service technician for a heating and air company, but it wasn't enough to support a new family. In fact, he was still living with his own parents on the other side of town. So here you had this young couple so excited about their new baby, but Bruce and Melinda knew they needed some help. They knew their kids just weren't financially prepared for this huge step. So Bruce and Melinda talked it over. They decided the best way they could support Anna and Jeff was to make them an offer. They told Anna that she could invite Jeff to come and live with them in their house. That way, the two of them could be together, and once the baby was born, Bruce and Melinda could be right there to help out. It seemed like the perfect solution. It would let the young couple save up their money so they could eventually get a place of their own. When they told Anna about their plan, she was so happy and so grateful. She immediately called Jeff, and he was just as thrilled. He said yes, he would love to move in. So it took a few months to get everything sorted out, but finally, in June of 2016, Jeff moved out of his parents' house and into the Pleskovic home. And it was in that very same month that Anna and Jeff welcomed their baby daughter into the world. But almost as soon as Jeff moved in, some really strange and disturbing things started happening around the property. Just a few days after Jeff had settled in, he and Anna were home alone. They were on the main floor, having dinner at the kitchen table. At some point, Jeff just happened to glance out one of the back windows that looked out into their backyard. Now, their property had this huge, sprawling backyard. It was almost like a big, open, communal space shared by a row of houses. So Jeff is looking out into this big yard, and he sees something strange off in the distance. It was dark out, so he couldn't quite make it out at first. He stood up and walked over to the window for a better look. And as he got closer, he could see them. Way off at the back edge of their property, there were 4 strangers. They were just standing there, looking like they were smoking something, and they were all staring up at the Pleskovic house. Jeff just stood there at the window, watching them, not sure what to think. He called Anna over to the window, and she came and stood next to him. The two of them are just looking out, trying to figure out what to do. On one hand, these 4 people they didn't know were clearly trespassing on their property. But on the other hand, they weren't really doing anything aggressive. They were just standing there, smoking and staring. Hot was then as they watched, one of the 4 people started walking up the property straight towards their house. The person stopped next to the family's trampoline, which was in the backyard, and started fiddling with it. At that point, Anna had seen enough. She said she didn't know what they were doing, but she felt totally uncomfortable. So she decided to call the police. The police came out, but by the time the squad car pulled up in front of the house, the 4 people in the back must have seen the flashing lights. They had taken off running. When the officer went into the backyard to look around, there was nobody there. And there was no sign that they had been there either. No cigarette butts, no footprints, nothing. They had just vanished into the night. The police officer told Jeff and Anna to call again if they came back, and then he left. A little while later, Bruce and Melinda got home, and Anna and Jeff told them what had happened. They all agreed it was incredibly strange. In all the decades they had lived in that house in Strongsville, they had never had anyone just wander onto their property and hang out in the middle of the night. For the next couple of days, the whole family was on edge, constantly checking the windows. But after a little while, as more time passed, the incident was mostly forgotten. Fast forward about 5 months to November of 2016. Anna was home alone one day with her young daughter. She was on the first floor towards the front of the house, playing with the baby, and as she was playing, she suddenly heard a sound coming from the back of the house. It sounded like someone was trying to open the sliding glass door. Her first thought was that it must be Jeff or one of her parents. Maybe they forgot their key or something. So she scooped up her daughter and started walking towards the back of the house to let them in. She walked into one of the back rooms, and before she even reached the door, she happened to look out one of the windows that faced the backyard. And what she saw made her freeze. Standing right there, with his face pressed up against the glass, was an unknown man. He was just staring into the house. Anna just stood there, completely frozen, staring back at him. Then the guy noticed her. He immediately ducked down out of view. Anna's mind was racing. This must have been the person who was trying to break in through the back door. She was home alone with her baby, and she had no idea what this man wanted or if he was going to try to break in again. So she just turned and ran. She ran back towards the front of the house, up the stairs, and into a bedroom. She locked the door behind her and called the police. But again, by the time the police arrived and searched the area, they couldn't find anyone. There was no sign of an attempted forced entry on the door either. The officers told her that they were sure it was a traumatic experience, but there was really nothing they could do. There was no evidence, and they had no idea who it could have been. They just told her to keep her doors locked and to call them back if she saw anyone suspicious on her property again. Naturally, after the police left, Anna called Jeff and her parents. They were horrified and rushed home to comfort her. After the initial shock wore off, the family started to wonder. They thought, do you think this could be connected to those 4 strangers they saw on the property a few months ago? It just seemed too weird to be a coincidence. But then that led to the bigger question, who were these people and what did they want? Why were they targeting their family? As far as they knew, the Pleskovic family didn't have any enemies. In fact, most people in Strongsville absolutely adored them, especially Melinda, the mother. For over 20 years, Melinda had been a middle school teacher in town, and her students loved her. She was also a huge part of the local soccer community. She had played in college and was still really passionate about it, so she was an amazing coach. And for many of the parents in Strongsville, Melinda was an inspiration. She wasn't just a mother to Anna, she was also the mother of an 18-year-old boy named Kyle who had Down syndrome and was nonverbal. And Melinda just had this unbelievable way with him. She was so good to him, she included him in everything, and she gave him the best possible life. Anytime you saw Kyle with his mother, he was just beaming with happiness. Even though he couldn't speak, it was so obvious how much he loved his mom. But regardless of who these strangers were or why they were lurking around, the Pleskovic family was now completely on edge. They found themselves constantly looking out the windows, especially at night, terrified that these people were going to come back and try to break in again. And unfortunately, they did come back. In January of 2017, just 2 months after Anna saw that man at the window, Bruce's car was broken into. It had been parked in their driveway. Someone got inside and stole his laptop. So Bruce called the police again. He told them he was sure this was connected to the people who were harassing his family. The police seemed to believe him, and they started looking around and asking questions, but they never found the laptop or the person who took it. And so once again, the family was left on their own, and the police just said to let them know if anything else happened. A few months went by, and then in July of that year, Anna, Jeff, and their daughter were all home together one night. Anna happened to look out one of the back windows on the first floor. And there they were again. Out at the very back of the property, in the exact same spot where she and Jeff had seen those 4 strangers a year before, were 3 more strangers. They were just standing there, looking up at the house. Horrified, Anna called out to Jeff, telling him there were people in the backyard. This time, Anna pulled out her phone and started calling the police. But as she was on the phone, Jeff got really upset. He was tired of these people harassing his family and making them feel unsafe in their own home. So he grabbed a flashlight and stormed out the back door to confront them himself. But as soon as Jeff stepped outside, before he could even shine the light on them, the 3 people turned and ran, vanishing into the darkness. So when the police finally showed up, they were already well aware of all the calls they'd been getting from this family. They went out and did a serious search of the area, but just like every other time, they found nothing. And so the family was told, once again, to call if they saw anything else. The very next month, in August, Anna was home with her daughter. Her mother, Melinda, was upstairs. Anna was in the playroom at the front of the house with the baby when she heard it again. That familiar sound of someone trying to open the back sliding glass door. Immediately, her heart started pounding. She knew what happened the last time she heard that sound. But she thought to herself, okay, I can't just immediately call the police. I need to at least look and see if it's someone I know. So she picked up her daughter, stood up, and walked to the edge of the room she was in. She carefully peeked her head around the corner, down the hallway that gave her a clear view of the back sliding glass door. And when she finally saw who was there, she screamed. There were two large adults standing at the back door, actively trying to force it open. When she screamed, the two strangers heard her. They turned around and took off running. Melinda, who was upstairs, heard her daughter screaming and came flying down the stairs, trying to figure out what was wrong. Anna was hysterical, the baby was crying, and so Melinda was the one who called the police, this time to report what her daughter had just seen. The police came out, they searched the property, and they couldn't find anyone. So again, the police left. They told the family they were sorry this was happening, but they couldn't do anything without more evidence. They promised they would get out there as fast as they could if anything else happened, hoping that one of these times they would finally catch these people. But for now, they just didn't have much to go on. The next month, in September, one of Melinda's car keys went missing. And whoever had stolen it started using it to randomly start her car in the middle of the night. They also used it to set off her car alarm at all hours. During that same time, they also discovered that someone had jammed nails into the tires of Bruce's car. Of course, the family called the police and told them what was going on, but there was still nothing the police could do. Melinda was getting desperate. So she actually went on Facebook and made a post telling everyone that someone had stolen her keys and pleading for them to just give them back. In the post, she begged whoever was harassing her family to just leave them alone. But unfortunately, the post didn't do any good. The harassment continued. A month later, on October 19th, Jeff was home alone when he heard the sound of the back sliding glass door rattling. Now, he knew that every time Anna had heard that sound, there was always some stranger at the back door. So, Jeff grabbed the family dog and he very carefully peered down the hallway towards the back door to see who was there. And right as he poked his head out, he saw him. It was a large adult figure wearing a hood, trying to open the door. The dog saw the person and started barking, running towards the door. Jeff ran after the dog. The person outside, trying to break in, saw the dog and Jeff running towards him, so he turned and ran away. Jeff and the dog stayed inside the house and just watched the guy take off across the property and disappear into the trees. Jeff called the police, but just like all the other times, they came out, and there was simply nothing they could do. Just 4 days later, on October 23rd, Jeff, along with his young daughter and Bruce, went to the local Applebee's where Anna worked. They were going to have dinner there and have Anna be their waitress. After they finished eating, they said their goodbyes to Anna, left the restaurant, got in their cars, and drove back to the house. When they got there, Bruce was the first one up the steps to the front door. It was locked, so he knocked. His son Kyle came and unlocked the door for him. Bruce went inside, followed closely by Jeff, who was carrying his daughter. They got inside, and Bruce walked through the house to the kitchen at the back. He flipped on the lights, and he saw something on the kitchen floor. When Jeff saw it, he immediately turned around and ran out of the house, carrying his daughter. He grabbed Kyle on the way out and just took them straight outside. Once Jeff was safely outside, he called 911. And when you listen to the recording of that call, it sounds like Jeff is in total shock, unable to even process what he has just seen. He told the operator that someone had been attacked in his house. He said it was Mel Pleskovich. He said he didn't know who did it, that they just came home and found her on the kitchen floor. Jeff and Bruce had just discovered Melinda. She was lying on the kitchen floor. She had been stabbed over 35 times and shot 3 times. She was rushed to the hospital, but she would die that night. The whole family was in shock, completely unable to process what had just happened. But they were all convinced of one thing. Whoever had done this to Melinda had to be connected to all of those strange and suspicious people who had been lurking around their property for almost 2 years. In fact, right after Jeff called 911, while he was still inside the kitchen kneeling next to his dying wife, Bruce made his own call to 911, and in it, he blamed the police department for not doing more. He told the operator to please come, that he thought his wife had been killed by someone. He said they'd had people breaking into their house all year, and now someone had killed her. The Strongsville Police Department came out in full force for this case, and they would solve it in just 4 days. And when they finally went public with who killed Melinda, no one in the community could believe it. It turns out that on October 23rd, the night Melinda was found, Jeff had been at the house with her, her son Kyle, and his own young daughter. At some point that evening, before he went to Applebee's, Jeff had put his daughter down in her playpen. Then he went into the kitchen where Melinda was. He walked up to her, pulled out a knife, and stabbed her over and over again more than 35 times. Then, when Melinda fell to the ground, Jeff pulled out a gun and shot her 3 more times, just to make sure she was dead. And while he was doing this, his own daughter was just a few feet away in her playpen, and Kyle was also nearby, completely unable to understand the horror that was happening to his mother. With these 2 innocent children so close by, Jeff cleaned off his weapons. He took off his bloody clothes and hid everything inside of his car. Then he just scooped up his daughter and left the house, leaving Kyle all alone inside with his dying mother on the kitchen floor. He just left him there, shut the door, locked it, and then drove with his daughter to Applebee's to have a perfectly normal dinner with Melinda's husband and daughter. After several hours, when they got back to the house, Jeff knew exactly what was waiting for them inside. And he still let Bruce go in first to be the one to discover his own dying wife on the kitchen floor. Very little is known about why Jeff did this, because Jeff has never given his motive for the crime. The main theory is that Jeff was in serious financial trouble. The wedding was just a couple of days away, and he wasn't going to be able to pay for it. The wedding venue had apparently called Melinda to let her know that they were canceling the wedding because her future son-in-law couldn't afford it. And so, the theory goes, Melinda confronted Jeff about his money problems, and he just snapped and killed her. But that can't possibly be the whole story, because it would turn out that Jeff was responsible for every single suspicious event that had taken place around the Pleskovic property leading up to the murder. That means every time they saw strangers lurking in the backyard, or every time someone was trying to break into the house, it was all because of Jeff. Either it was literally Jeff himself outside, pretending to be a suspicious person, or he had asked his friends or even hired people to go onto the property and pretend to be stalking the family. Other times, Jeff was the only one who supposedly saw these people, and then miraculously, by the time anyone else looked, they were gone. He was lying. A childhood friend of Jeff's, who was living in the area when this all happened, said that the generally accepted reason in Strongsville for why Jeff did this was because he hated Melinda. Even though she had opened up her home to him, he loathed her. And as soon as he moved in back in 2016, he started plotting to kill her. All of those suspicious events, all of that harassment, it was all Jeff's attempt to build this incredibly intricate alibi. He wanted to create this narrative that a group of dangerous strangers was targeting the family. That way, when he finally killed Melinda, everyone would think it was them. And at first, it worked perfectly. Everyone believed it, from the police to the family to their friends. Everyone thought that strangers had finally broken into the house and killed Melinda. There was so little suspicion on Jeff immediately after her murder that he actually served as a pallbearer at Melinda's funeral. But ultimately, the police would discover the knife and the bloody clothes hidden in the back of Jeff's car. They arrested him and presented him with a mountain of evidence. And Jeff confessed to killing Melinda. However, he wouldn't give any additional information about the crime. He just said yes, he did it. He also never offered any kind of apology or explanation to the family. He was ultimately sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 33 years. During Jeff's trial, there was a completely heartbreaking moment when Bruce, Melinda's husband, spoke. He said that their son, Kyle, doesn't understand that his mother is gone. And so now, every time they go out to eat, which is something Kyle loves to do and used to love doing with his mother, he'll just sit and stare out the window. He just sits there, eagerly expecting his mother to show up at any minute. But of course, she never does. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. As usual, 5-6-year-old Yoshika Yasutake dusts a piano in her family's small, clean Helmsley home on the 15th of April, 2018. Yoshika lifted the piano lid and dusted each key after dusting the outside. However, she was careful not to press any keys accidentally and make a sound. She wanted to avoid that. Yoshika always dreaded going to the piano when she cleaned the house because she was afraid of making a sound. Yoshika lowered the piano lid after dusting it inside and out, then dusting each book in a bookcase next to a window. As she did, she heard birds chirping, cars driving, and people talking out the window. After hearing this, Yoshika stopped dusting and looked out the window at the beautiful town. All the roadside stone cottages were glowing in spring sun. Yoshika felt sad about all the things she was missing as she looked out and listened to her village. Yoshika was a world-class pianist. She played packed symphony halls after studying at London's Royal College of Music. Sometimes royal family members were in the audience. She was huge. Yoshika stopped playing the piano after her younger sister Rina returned home. Yoshika became angry when she thought of Rina and turned to stare at her closed bedroom door. Just briefly, Yoshika wished Rina hadn't come home. Because since Rina came home, Yoshika's family seemed to have prioritized nothing else. Only Rina mattered. Yoshika, Rina, and Takahiro, their 51-year-old brother, comprised the Yasutake family. The 80-year-old mother of the three siblings lived with them. Their father died several years earlier. Yoshika and Takahiro were impressive in different ways. Both Yoshika and Takahiro were great pianists and writers. But Rina was better. Rina could speak Greek, Latin, English, Japanese, and her own dialect with a grammar system. Rina was an amazing artist, and everyone wanted her paintings. Rina refused to sell. Maybe she did, but rarely. But that only hyped her art. Getting a Rina painting was so valuable. Rina received scholarships to prestigious private schools as a child, and after graduating high school, she received a full-ride scholarship to Cambridge, one of the world's top universities. Everyone thought Rina would become a world-famous artist. There was something dark inside Rina that no one could identify. Only when she had sudden outbursts of anger did people see this side of her that didn't fit with the rest of her. These anger outbursts were brief, so people dismissed them as a sign of extreme genius. Her brain sometimes couldn't handle how smart she was, and she got mad and frustrated. Rina was completely different when she returned home after graduating from Cambridge. It was like something inside her broke and stayed broken. Rina, had a sudden outburst of anger 2 days after returning home. Rina's rage persisted. After days of rage, her family asked her what was wrong. However, Rina refused to discuss it. Rina eventually locked herself in her family home bedroom and refused to speak to her family for weeks. Rina was different when she emerged after several weeks. She rarely spoke to family members unless necessary. She rarely left the house or her room unless necessary. This was not Rina's post-college phase. It became Rina's life. She stayed in that bedroom for decades, so much so that the family's neighbors didn't know she existed. Yoshika returned to the books on the shelf after staring at her sister's closed bedroom door. She cleaned the house after dusting them. She dropped the duster, and Yoshika quietly tiptoed to Rina's closed bedroom door. She knocked softly. Rina hated loud noises, so Yoshika couldn't play the piano because it disturbed her. After Yoshika's light knock, she mentally counted to 30. Rina told her not to come in right away. If you knock and wait 30 seconds, I may let you in. Yoshika mentally counts 1, 2, 3. Then Rina tells Yoshika, okay, you can enter from inside the room. Slowly turning the knob, Yoshika opened her sister's bedroom door. It revealed this pitch-black room. Small, cramped space. Rina sat silently on her bed with all the shades and blinds drawn. So Yoshika kept her head down and avoided looking at Rina. She wanted to avoid upsetting her. Yoshika entered the room and picked up Rina's dirty dishes from the table. Yoshika turned and left again. As she did, she glanced at Rina's bedroom project. Rina had told her family she was doing this master's work, but wouldn't say more. To work on this masterwork, she needed a dark room, a quiet house, and complete focus. Family support was needed as she did this. Rina never defined this masterwork. She said it was special and combined all her life's elements. Spirit, body, soul. Even the family would build this masterpiece. Rina replied, oh, you'll know when the time is right, when her family asked how they could help her make this master work. Yoshika couldn't see the master work, so she turned her head back down and shuffled out of Rina's room, closing the door. Yoshika then went to the kitchen and dumped Rina's dishes in the sink, which was already clean because Rina's rule was to keep the house clean. Clean dishes, no dust. It had to be perfect. She could only work on this masterwork if she was always clean. Her brother, Takahiro, entered the kitchen as Yoshika cleaned and dried Rina's dishes and put them away. He would tell Yoshika they should leave the house and go to the market to buy Rina some supplies so she could keep working on this master work. Since everything was about Rina, Yoshika was furious that they had to do this. She hid her feelings and told her brother to let go. Takahiro viewed Rina differently than Yoshika. Yoshika hated Rina because now that she was home, she had to give up her career as a great pianist to help Rina with her master's work. However, Takahiro was happy to give up writing to support Rina. Because he believed in Rina and thought her master work would be the greatest art in human history, Takahiro was proud to participate. Takahiro and his family didn't know what this masterwork was. Takahiro and Rina got along better than Yoshika and Rina. Rina told Takahiro what she needed to build this masterwork. Rina told Takahiro what she needed that day, so he and Yoshika went to get it. Takahiro and Yoshika donned jackets and left. After getting out there, they both flipped their collars up, covered their faces, and leaned down. Because they avoided eye contact with others. This family was already private, but Rina told them to be even more private and not interact with others. They would hide when out in public. Yoshika and Takahiro went to the pharmacy. They sneaked in and bought surgical spirits, a medical alcohol. After buying that, the brother and sister put their collars back up and went outside to an old used bookstore to buy a palm reading book which uses hand lines to predict the future. When the brother and sister bought this book, they kept their heads down and didn't speak to the cashier. The brother and sister rushed home after getting their book. They arrived to find the door locked. Instead of opening their own door, the brother and sister knocked and waited. They heard 4 locks turning when their mother came to the door. Yoshika and Takahiro entered, closed the door, and locked the 4 deadbolts. Rina insisted that no family member carry a house key. It was too risky to lose the key in town and have someone enter their house and see Rina's work. They could not allow that. No one had keys. Each return home required knocking. Rina was worried about someone entering the house and seeing what she was doing, so they had 4 locks on the door. To Rina's closed bedroom door, Yoshika carried the bag with the surgical spirits and palm reading book. Yoshika placed the bag outside the door, turned around, and left without knocking. As she did, she heard Rina's door open slightly. Yoshika turned around and saw a tiny, skinny arm reach out from behind the door. The bag was grabbed and pulled back into the room, closing and locking the door. Helmsley was a quiet village where unusual events were noticed. Stone houses were older than trees, and the residents had lived in the valley for generations. Their quiet lives were nice. But the Yasutakes had always puzzled them. They were polite when they spoke, but they were so rare they could have been ghosts. They moved to the UK years ago and settled in this small cottage. The town initially liked them because their sister was a famous pianist and their brother was a writer. But the family had cloaked themselves in silence for years. They were like a fortress in a quiet English town. 3 days later, on the 18th of April 2018, Yoshika was reading in the kitchen when she heard her brother Takahiro talking to Rina. Takahiro and Rina were no longer talking face to face. Rina was in her bedroom with the door closed, and Takahiro was sitting on the ground with his back to the door talking to her. Unlike Yoshika and Rina, who had a bad relationship and rarely talked, Takahiro and Rina had a good relationship and did this often. They talked for hours through the door. Yoshika briefly ignored her brother and sister's chatter and returned to her book. However, she started hearing her brother's words, which was strange. After putting down her book, she started listening to Takahiro. His question was how to do that without making sense. How? Your soul alone. How? How? Yoshika sensed her brother's confusion and possible upset. She couldn't resist. She put her book down, and Yoshika walked out to the living room, looking down at her brother for a hint. He and Rina stopped talking when Takahiro saw Yoshika and shook his head, stood up, and left. After Takahiro left, Yoshika quietly walked over to Rina's bedroom door and pressed her ear against the wood to see if she could hear Rina and catch something she was saying to explain what she had heard. But all she heard was Rina slowly shuffling toward her bed in the back of her bedroom. Complete silence followed. Yoshika left the door and returned to the kitchen to read again. She could not focus on the book because a wave of sadness was washing over her. Yoshika felt this way because she was thinking about how close she and Rina were as kids. Very close for most of their lives. Even after Rina became reclusive, they remained friends. But something happened 5 years earlier in 2013 that ended their relationship forever. Rina came out of her bedroom that day, and Yoshika offered to read her palm. The sisters occasionally did this for each other. It helped them bond. Rina extended her hand, and Yoshika traced a long horizontal line on her palm. Rina had unusual hands. Simian lines on palms are rare. Rina had one. It resembles a hand-length horizontal line. Simian lines in palm reading can be good or bad. It may indicate a mystic or visionary. So that's good. It could mean they're aggressive or have a terrible disease. The downside, Rina thought her simian line was good. She claimed visionary soul. On this day in 2013, the family was banned from a local supermarket because Rina got upset with some staff members and screamed and yelled at them. So they were banned. Yoshika contemplates this and looks at Rina's palm, saying the simian line. You may have been aggressive at the supermarket because of this. Perhaps you're aggressive. However, Rina was so offended that she whipped her hand back and yelled at Yoshika, calling her an idiot and saying, you don't understand my vision. I'll show the world this vision someday, and you and those grocery store idiots won't understand. Rina then punched and kicked Yoshika. Yoshika screams and defends herself. Takahiro, the brother, ran in to separate them. Rina was prone to angry outbursts, but this was her first physical attack. So Rina's mother worried she had a condition that caused her to lash out physically. Rina went to the doctor. The doctor would say, there's no physical cause. However, Rina appears to be having a mental breakdown and needs psychiatric treatment. Maybe even hospitalization. Rina rejected treatment and blamed Yoshika for everything. Rina stopped leaving her bedroom after that. She used to leave every couple of months, but now she stays 24/7. Rina added all these new rules for her family to follow so she could focus on her masterwork in her bedroom. Nobody had house keys and added those 4 locks to the door. The family was also instructed to learn Rina's new Japanese dialect. None would understand what they were saying. It would further shield them from outside evils. Rina also made sure her family got rid of their phones, TVs, and computers. Yoshika sat in the kitchen longer, thinking about how sad she was to lose contact with her sister. Yoshika regretted her simian line remarks. As usual, Yoshika pushed her feelings for Rina down and returned to reading her book. Yoshika saw her brother Takahiro sitting against Rina's bedroom door more often than usual, carrying on hushed conversations with Rina for several weeks. Yoshika noticed Takahiro cooking all Rina's meals. Takahiro seemed to have taken over cooking Rina's food from their mother. Yoshika collected Rina's dirty dishes because she was in charge of cleaning the house. As soon as Takahiro started cooking for Rina, Yoshika noticed more food on her plates. Rina was eating less than usual. This alarmed Yoshika. Rina was small already. Only 90 pounds, she was 4 foot 11 inches tall. Yoshika worried that she must eat. She is too small to skip meals. One day in mid-May, Yoshika entered Rina's bedroom and saw that all her dishes were full of the food she had been given. She hardly touched them. Yoshika actually never spoke to Rina in the bedroom. But she couldn't resist this time. Without looking at Rina Yoshika, she gathered up the plates of food and told her to eat more. Rina remained silent. Yoshika turned and left the room quickly. After that, Takahiro told Yoshika, "Rina doesn't want you in her room again. Rina will now put your dishes outside the door. Thus, you avoid entering that room." Around the same time, Rina, who usually only left her bedroom to use the bathroom, started doing so at night when her family was asleep to avoid them. Rina had almost no family interactions by this point. Rina sent Takahiro and Yoshika to the store more and more in early August to buy surgical spirits and medical alcohol. Takahiro and Yoshika didn't know what Rina was doing with these surgical spirits, but they bought them to support her. They would return home with these bottles, and Takahiro would barely open Rina's door to tuck the bottle in before Rina took it. Rina would never give them her empty bottle after the door closed. The bottle went in and stayed. Takahiro and Rina appeared to fight on the 18th of August, 2018. Yoshika was in the kitchen when she saw Takahiro sitting against Rina's bedroom door having a quiet conversation. Takahiro stood up, turned around, and yelled into the door. I said, "Your soul was insufficient." After Rina replied, Takahiro said, "No, please." He seemed to be pleading with Rina to reconsider. Takahiro opened Rina's bedroom door and walked inside before Yoshika could ask him what was wrong, and the house went silent. The room was too scary for Yoshika to enter. She stayed in the kitchen and listened. It was quiet for 15 minutes. Takahiro left Rina's bedroom and closed the door, looking calm. Yoshika looked over and asked what was going on. Takahiro would smile and tell Yoshika, "Rina's masterwork is almost done." Takahiro then asked Yoshika if she remembered Rina saying her master's work would require family help. However, she said, "We will know when to participate." Yoshika replied, "I remember." "Now is the time," Takahiro said. Takahiro told Yoshika to get more surgical spirits at the store. Yoshika followed him without question. They bought 3 times as much surgical spirits at the store. After they got home, Takahiro alone went into Rina's bedroom with surgical spirits. He closed the door, and Yoshika sat in the kitchen for 10 minutes until Takahiro returned without the surgical spirits. He would approach Yoshika and say Rina is ready to reconcile. Sitting by the door and talking to her will let you help her create her masterwork. This news frustrated and relieved Yoshika. She never thought it fair that Rina had completely cut her off after her 2013 palm reading simian line joke. Rina also made Yoshika's life difficult for years. Yoshika had to give up her piano dreams, friends, and life goals to support Rina. Despite that, Yoshika missed Rina deeply. They used to be close. She wanted that relationship back. First, Yoshika sat against Rina's closed bedroom door and didn't say anything. Rina also said nothing. But then the floodgates opened and Yoshika began crying about how her and Rina's relationship had gone south and how she wanted to fix it. Now, when Yoshika would talk through the door to Rina, like when she was trying to open it to drop something off, Rina would usually start banging on something inside the room to tell her to stop and leave. Yoshika spent her time pouring her heart out to Rina through the door, but she noticed no pounding from inside. She was heard by Rina. Next day, Yoshika and Takahiro went to the store again and bought more surgical spirits to bring back to the house. This time, Yoshika was allowed to enter Rina's bedroom. Rina was on the bed when Takahiro and Yoshika entered the dark bedroom. Takahiro showed Yoshika what to do as they approached her. The final step of Rina's master's project. They had to rub Rina's body with surgical spirits. Yoshika didn't understand why they were doing this, but she respected Rina's plan and was happy to be part of creating this master work, so she didn't ask any questions. After rubbing alcohol on Rina for about 10 minutes, the brother and sister left, closed the door, and Yoshika sat down against the door and poured her heart out to Rina again. It was very therapeutic. In many ways, Yoshika was happy again. She was finally fixing her relationship with Rina. Yoshika's daily routine changed over several weeks. After getting all these surgical spirits, she and her brother would rub them on Rina, and then Yoshika would chat with her through the door all day. All done. After Yoshika and Takahiro applied these surgical spirits to Rina's body on the 25th of September 2018, Yoshika told Rina she had a special surprise for her. Yoshika was in a good mood today because she was feeling good about her new relationship with her sister and because she and her brother usually didn't talk to the pharmacist who sold the surgical spirits because they tried to hide and make it clear they weren't talking. On this day, the pharmacist was talking to Yoshika. Yoshika decided to respond. Their conversation lacked substance. Finally, the pharmacist asked Yoshika why she was buying surgical spirits. Yoshika would say, "They are for my sister Rina, who needs more and more of them every day. She is working on something special, but we don't know what it is, but this is part of it, and we know it will be worth it." For Yoshika, who had little social contact, this conversation was great, even though it seemed pointless. She felt ready to do something special for Rina when she got home. After Yoshika and Takahiro left Rina's bedroom with surgical spirits, Yoshika surprised Rina. Yoshika went to the family piano near Rina's bedroom. Yoshika was nervous, but she sat on the bench, opened the lid, and touched the keys. Yoshika was surprised to learn that she would play the Waltz of the Flowers, a classical piece inspired by the composer's love for his sister. Yoshika thought this was the perfect song to perform in this house for Rina. She will know I adore her. Yoshika played the song, listening for Rina to bang something to stop her. Yet again, she did not. It was quiet. Yoshika played this lovely song. When it happened again, Yoshika waited for Rina to yell or be mad about playing loud music in the house. It was quiet, though. Yoshika felt close to her sister again, and she soon started crying with joy. But Yoshika heard a bang when she closed the piano lid. It wasn't from Rina's bedroom. Coming from the front door. Yoshika heard a scream outside the front door moments later. Police speak. Before Yoshika could open the door, her mother ran there. She opened all 4 locks, but only opened one crack and yelled at the police to leave. Police were pushing on the door to get the mother out of the way. Yoshika moved over and looked through the crack and saw more than 2 police officers. It was an army of police, firefighters, and EMTs. There was an ambulance. Soon, the police officer yelling, "Open up," pushed and opened the door completely. A uniformed horde flooded the home. As soon as the officers entered the house, they opened every door as if looking for something. Finally, they opened Rina's bedroom door. Once they did, Yoshika watched the officers stop at the doorway. They cursed, yelled, and looked away. Officers then entered Rina's bedroom. 1 minute later, they started talking on the radio. Emergency medical personnel entered the house with a stretcher. After entering Rina's bedroom, Yoshika, Takahiro, and their mother watched the stretcher return with officers and technicians. Rina was stretchered, and she looked awful. Her eyes were rolled back in her head, and her skin was translucent. She looked like a skeleton. The events in that family's home became international news. And not because Rina was secretly painting a masterpiece in her bedroom. The facts are here. Rina stopped eating in April 2018. She said she only needed her visionary soul nourished. Because of her visionary soul, she didn't need food. Yoshika overheard Takahiro telling Rina, "Only your soul how?" He was trying to figure out how Rina's soul would sustain her. It made no sense. 4 months later, on August 18, Yoshika heard her brother and sister talking through the bedroom door again. Except today, Takahiro stood up and yelled through the door, "I told you your soul was not enough," sounding like he was fighting with Rina. He then broke into Rina's bedroom and stayed there in silence for 15 minutes before calmly telling Yoshika that Rina is almost done with her master's work and we just need to get her more surgical spirits. Takahiro actually yelled at Rina through the door because she wasn't responding to his attempts to talk to her. His suspicion was that she wasn't eating. He shouted at her and barged into her room to find Rina unresponsive. No movement, no speech. He stood there, unsure what to do. As Takahiro stands there, he realizes the time. Get involved now. Takahiro left the bedroom with Yoshika and went to the pharmacy to get more surgical spirits. When they returned, Takahiro alone covered Rina's bedroom in these spirits. Because she had asked him to do that before, and he thought she needed more spirits now that she couldn't talk or move. Her visionary soul will nourish her while she finishes this master work. For the next month, Takahiro and Yoshika applied these spirits to Rina's body, believing they were helping her finish her masterwork. On September 25, while Yoshika and Takahiro were buying more spirits at the pharmacy, the pharmacist finally spoke to Yoshika because he had noticed that these surgical spirits smelled bad every time they came in. It smelled terrible when they arrived this day. The pharmacist finally asked Yoshika what these surgical spirits were for. Yoshika gave this weird answer about how the spirits were for her sister, and she was working on her masterwork in her bedroom, and it would be worth it. After Yoshika and Takahiro left that day, the pharmacist was so alarmed that he called the police. The police found Rina not building a masterwork in her bedroom when they arrived at the family home. She had been dead in bed for 6 weeks. Rina died around August 18 when Takahiro entered and found her unresponsive. So Yoshika and Rina never reconciled. Why Takahiro told Yoshika that Rina was ready to reconcile with him is unknown. Rina was dead at the time and would not have said anything. Yoshika had fake heart-to-hearts with her sister through the door and played her fake music. From August 18th until September, when the police broke into their home, Yoshika and Takahiro spent nearly every day rubbing this strange medical alcohol on their dead sister's body because they believed she wanted it. Alcohol was actually mummifying her body. The conditions inside that room must have been unimaginable to outsiders in the weeks before the police discovery. Yasutake family saw it as their reality. Because of their prolonged isolation, their minds had adapted to a different set of rules. They didn't see a medical emergency when Rina stopped talking. A spiritual shift occurred. They did not see death when she froze. They saw her genius in action. The bulk surgical spirits they bought were chemical preservatives. The body decomposes naturally after death. But Takahiro and Yoshika were constantly applying this highly concentrated alcohol to her skin, drying out the tissues before the bacteria could break them down. They were unknowingly performing an ancient preservation ritual. They kept her skin, hair, and body from breaking down. This showed them the master work was working. They felt validated every day when they entered that dark room and saw that her body was not changing normally. They believed these surgical spirits connected her soul to the physical world. Emergency personnel entered that bedroom to a strong surgical spirit smell that stung their eyes. But behind that chemical smell was the smell of a human body kept in a dark room for over a month. Bedroom walls were covered in Renus's art. Strange, complex paintings that moved in the dim light. The floor was covered in philosophy, language, and art books. Rena's bed was in the center. Her body was properly cared for, and she wore her usual clothes. She had brushed her hair and cleaned her face. She was absolutely skeletal. Her skin had tightened over her bones, making her a mummy. Police officers entering that room were unprepared for what they saw. They anticipated a sibling dispute or neglect. They were surprised to find 3 people living with a preserved corpse as if it were alive. The discovery shocked the entire department immediately. To document the scene, forensic investigators had to wear protective gear due to the biological and chemical fumes in the cottage. The town of Helmsley was stunned. They had lived with this quiet family for years. They had seen the brother and sister walking to the shops with collars up and heads down. They knew they were private, but never imagined something so bizarre and tragic was happening behind those locked doors. Local news covered the story, and national and international journalists visited the quiet village. Satellite trucks and reporters flooded the stone cottages and narrow streets, trying to figure out how this could have happened in such a peaceful place. Renus's death investigation was complicated. The first step for forensic pathologists was to determine her death date and manner. However, her body was preserved by surgical spirits, making an autopsy difficult. Normal toxicological tests were difficult due to her tissue chemical changes. After weeks of careful examination, medical examiners found no physical violence or trauma on her body. Strangulation, defensive wounds, and poison were absent. Only that her body had run out of energy made sense. She starved herself to death for spiritual mastery. Attorneys had to decide what to charge the family. The UK has a charge for this. Preventing a proper burial. A lengthy prison sentence is possible for this serious crime. Yoshika Takahiro and their 80-year-old mother were arrested and charged with this crime. However, as the legal process progressed, everyone involved realized this was no ordinary criminal case. The family did not act like body hiders. They were honest in interviews. They were completely honest about their actions. They detailed how they cared for Rina, rubbed surgical spirits on her body, and waited for her to finish her master's work to the police. She wasn't mentioned in the past. They felt Rina's presence. The court ordered extensive psychological evaluations for Yoshika Takahiro and their mother. These psychiatrists interviewed one of their most unusual cases. They found no malice in the family. They did not hurt Rina or hide her death for financial gain. They did it out of love and devotion. But their love was filtered through shared delusions. Psychologists diagnosed the family with folie à trois, a rare form of shared delusional disorder. This psychological condition involves transferring delusions from one person to close friends. In this household, Rina was dominant. Her genius, artistic talent, and charisma allowed her to control her siblings and mother. When Rina developed delusions about her soul supporting her body, her family didn't question her. They trusted her completely. Being so isolated from society meant no one to check their reality. No one to tell them their beliefs were impossible. Rina retreated deeper into her room over time, and the family protected her. No one questioned her rules. Communication devices were removed. Her invented language was taught. Lived in complete silence. They formed a belief loop. That loop continued after Rina died. Instead, it adapted. Takahiro could not believe his sister, the genius who would create the greatest art in history, was dead. His mind came up with an explanation for her survival. Simply moving on with her master's work. Since Yoshika and their mother were in the same closed loop, they accepted his explanation immediately. The court hearings were solemn. The family appeared fragile and out of touch with courtroom reality. They didn't understand why they were charged. They only followed Rina's instructions. They looked after her. They shielded her. They saw legal proceedings as another outside obstacle they had spent decades avoiding. The defense claimed that trying this family would be a miscarriage of justice. They claimed that the family members were not criminally liable because their mental illness prevented them from understanding Rina's death. After reviewing psychiatric reports, the prosecution agreed. They realized imprisoning this family was pointless. They had no criminal intent or public danger. So the judge dropped all charges against Yoshika Takahiro and their mother. The court found them mentally unfit to stand trial. They were placed with local mental health services instead of jail. I tried to gently bring them back to reality so they could accept Rina's death and grieve her properly. After years, it's unclear if mental health professionals succeeded. Family returned to Helmsley's small stone cottage. 4 locks remain on the door. Light-blocking shades remain. Their neighbors rarely see them. Sometimes they see Takahiro or Yoshika walking to the store to buy groceries with their heads down and collars up, as usual. They no longer buy surgical spirits in bulk because police and medical authorities monitor them. However, they remain quiet and isolated. Many in the village believe the family has never accepted Rina's death. They believe the family speaks Rina's invented language in that quiet, clean cottage. They maintain absolute silence at home. The empty bedroom makes them think Rina is gone, or that her spirit is still working on the master work that will be revealed. The Yasutaka's tragedy is isolation. It shows how easily the mind can lose touch with reality when isolated. It shows how love and devotion can turn disturbing and bizarre in the dark. Yoshika Yasutake once filled concert halls with her music. Brother Takahiro could create worlds with words. Sister Rina was a genius with the world at her feet. They were all consumed by the darkness of a single room in a quiet English village. The Helmsley cottage silently commemorates this strange case. People who pass it on their way to the shops or castle ruins often wonder what's inside the windows. They wonder if this silence Rina demanded will last forever, or if the music will return. Death cannot break the family's bond, a shared faith that defied nature and society. The story ends with a quiet return to normal, not a dramatic confession or trial. A family hiding a secret only they know. They wait forever in their silent fortress for a master work that has reached its tragic end. Many thanks for watching. Comment your thoughts on today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you. Around 4:45 p.m. on the 11th of February 1995, a bleak and somber atmosphere blanketed Northumberland, a quiet, sprawling rural county in northern England. Amidst the torrential downpour pounding mercilessly from the sky, 50-year-old Eric Tollett sat at his desk inside his office. Eric was the owner of a successful furniture factory located in the area. From his vantage point, the only sound that broke the silence was the heavy, rhythmic thumping of rainwater beating against the metal roof. An intense, low-pressure weather system was moving through the region, spawning a thunderstorm so fierce it was rarely seen in those parts. Looking out the window at the worsening conditions, Eric couldn't help but smile with a sense of relief. Hours earlier, realizing how hazardous the weather was becoming, he made the executive decision to close the factory early. He sent all of his employees home so they could remain safely indoors before the storm reached its peak. Eric felt incredibly grateful that he was finally in a financial position to offer his workers a paid day off like this. Things had not always been so easy for him. 16 years prior, Eric had poured every single penny of his life savings, scraping together whatever cash he could find just to make the investment and buy this property. After purchasing it, the building was practically a derelict shell, requiring a massive, grueling renovation to transform it into a functional furniture factory where he could actually manufacture and sell goods. Now, after more than a decade and a half of relentless hard work, his business was highly successful. A single day of lost profits because of a storm was no longer a major concern. Instead of worrying about the numbers, Eric was simply using the quiet afternoon to catch up on some lingering administrative paperwork and enjoy some downtime with his family. Present at the factory with Eric that day was his girlfriend, Leslie, who was relaxing by the office window, casually watching the rain bounce off the glass. Also visiting was Eric's 60-year-old brother, Donald. To keep things lively, Donald had taken Leslie's 8-year-old son over to the factory's attached garage to play and pass the time while the storm raged outside. The office was peaceful, save for the rustling of papers as Eric shuffled through his files, when suddenly the office door swung open with a violent thud. Leslie's 8-year-old son burst into the room, his face completely pale and his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The boy was entirely alone. Donald was nowhere to be seen. Before Eric or Leslie could even utter a syllable to ask what was wrong, the child blurted out in sheer terror that Donald had suddenly collapsed onto the floor over in the attached garage. Initially, Eric froze, his mind struggling to process the sudden news. However, the first thought that flashed through his mind concerned his brother's well-being. Donald was 60 years old and had a history of underlying health issues. Hearing the boy say that Donald had collapsed triggered an immediate alarm bell in Eric's head. Oh my goodness, did he just have a heart attack? But on the other hand, a small, rational part of him wondered if the 8-year-old was simply overreacting to something completely benign. Whatever the case may be, Eric knew instantly that he had to drop everything and rush over to check on Donald. Eric and Leslie threw their paperwork aside and sprinted after the boy. Because the garage was directly attached to the main factory building, they were able to run straight through the interior corridors, never having to step foot outside into the raging storm. The moment the three of them reached the doorway of the attached garage, they were met with the harrowing sight of Donald lying completely motionless on the concrete floor. Before Eric could run over to his brother to assess his condition, he instinctively stopped right in the doorway. Turning sharply to Leslie and her son, he gave a firm, urgent command. "Go back to my office and call 911 right now. I'll be in there as soon as I can." Leslie nodded quickly, grabbing her son's hand and turning around to sprint back to the office. The moment they were out of sight, Eric rushed into the garage and knelt down right next to his brother's limp body. Leaning in close, Eric could tell immediately that Donald was not breathing. Trembling, he began feeling around for any pulse or sign of life. But right at that exact moment, something bizarre and terrifying happened. Eric suddenly felt an incredible, overwhelming tightness seize his chest. His lungs constricted, a sharp pain shot through him, and the air around him seemed to vanish into thin air. Before he could even comprehend what was happening or attempt to crawl back toward the doorway, his vision went pitch black. He lost consciousness instantly and collapsed onto the floor, right next to his dying brother. The horrific truth behind this mysterious phenomenon lay in a dark secret from the property's past, one that Eric had forgotten long ago. 16 years before Eric purchased the building to start his furniture business, the structure had served an entirely different purpose. It was a coal processing plant. Because of that specific history, there was a literal coal mine shaft entry directly connected to the warehouse structure. In the old days, coal would be brought straight up out of the mine through this entrance to be processed inside. When Eric bought the property, he was well aware of the abandoned mine shaft. However, the mine had been out of use for decades. The entrance leading down into the subterranean tunnels had been completely boarded up with thick wooden planks. Seeing that it played no role in his daily operations and posed no obvious threat, Eric hadn't given the mine a single thought in over 15 years. What Eric didn't know was that deep within the pitch-black, isolated void of the abandoned mine, a lethal toxic gas known as choke damp had been silently accumulating in massive quantities over the years. Choke damp is a suffocating cocktail of gases, primarily composed of carbon dioxide and nitrogen, which completely strips the oxygen out of an environment. On that exact afternoon, the severe low-pressure storm system outside caused a drastic drop in atmospheric pressure. This sudden change created a natural vacuum effect, literally pulling the highly concentrated choke damp gases up from the depths of the mine. The toxic fumes seeped out through the rotting cracks of the boarded-up entrance. Because the attached garage was a closed, poorly ventilated space, the deadly gas built up rapidly inside the room, transforming the garage into an invisible, highly lethal gas chamber capable of knocking out any living being within seconds. Donald had walked into the garage first, unknowingly inhaling the toxic air, which caused him to pass out and tragically suffocate to death. Eric had rushed in second, falling victim to the exact same oxygen-deprived environment. Fortunately, Eric's quick thinking in ordering Leslie and her son back to the office saved their lives, preventing them from stepping into the death trap. Leslie managed to dial emergency services just in time. When the paramedics and fire department arrived, they utilized proper breathing apparatuses to enter the garage. They quickly dragged both Eric and Donald out into the fresh air. Though Donald could not be revived due to the prolonged exposure, Eric still possessed a faint, flickering pulse. He was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. After intensive medical treatment, Eric miraculously regained consciousness and survived the ordeal, though he was left to carry the profound grief of losing his brother to an invisible, silent killer. At 10 a.m. on the 10th of September 2022, a profound sense of tranquility surrounded a small vessel sailing through the Pacific Ocean. The boat was floating less than a mile off the eastern coast of New Zealand, gliding over perfectly calm, light blue water. Standing on the deck was Diana Stewart, a 8-year-old woman with a passion for capturing the raw beauty of the natural world. As she looked out across the horizon, she spotted a magnificent albatross bird soaring gracefully across the clear sky. Reacting with practiced ease, she lifted her camera, adjusted her lens, and snapped a picture. Diana was an accomplished wildlife photographer and a dedicated member of the Nature Photography Society of New Zealand. She, along with 9 other avid members of the society, had chartered this specific boat for a highly anticipated birdwatching and photography excursion. So far, the trip had absolutely lived up to the immense hype. They had spent the last 2 hours sailing around the pristine waters, happily photographing a variety of beautiful, rare birds and unique marine wildlife. To top it all off, they had even been lucky enough to witness a couple of massive whales breaching in the distance. By all accounts, it had been a fantastic and highly successful day on the water. At this point, the group had finished their scheduled tour and the skipper was making his way back toward the shore. As the boat cruised along, Diana kept her eyes peeled, looking out for any last-minute photography opportunities that might present themselves. While scanning the water for more birds, something large caught her attention. There was a massive shadow moving just beneath the surface near the boat. It was moving at an angle, heading directly toward the vessel. Initially, Diana couldn't quite make out the shape through the ripples of the water, but then the image suddenly came into sharp focus. It was an enormous whale, and it was swimming so fast that it appeared it would pass right underneath them. Excited by the prospect of a close-up encounter, Diana pulled out her camera once more to capture the moment. But in the next split second, the worst possible scenario unfolded. The whale did not swim safely under the boat. Instead, it rammed directly into the side of the vessel with immense force. Before Diana or anyone else could react, the boat lurched violently onto its side and flipped completely upside down. Within a heartbeat, Diana and the rest of the passengers and crew were violently thrown off the deck and plunged into the frigid ocean water. The moment Diana hit the freezing water, the shock of the temperature threatened to paralyze her. Fortunately, she was wearing a modern automatic inflation life jacket. The second it was submerged, the mechanism triggered, and the vest quickly filled with air, forcing her back up toward the surface. Disoriented, gasping for air, and struggling to get her bearings in the shockingly cold water, Diana opened her eyes, only to be met with absolute pitch-black darkness. Furthermore, the noise was deafening. She couldn't hear the ocean or the screams of her companions. The only thing filling her ears was the roar of the boat's engine, which was still running. Putting her hands up, her fingers brushed against a solid curved surface directly above her head. It was then that she realized the grim reality of her situation. The boat had capsized directly on top of her. She was trapped inside a small, cramped air pocket underneath the overturned hull. Panic began to set in. Diana started calling out desperately for help, trying to maneuver her body downward so she could swim out from under the curved edges of the boat. However, she quickly hit a major obstacle. Her life jacket was fully inflated and packed with buoyant air. The intense upward force made it physically impossible for her to dive down beneath the rim of the boat to escape. She was pinned to the ceiling of the air pocket by her own safety gear. The water was freezing, the kind of cold that could induce severe hypothermia in less than 30 minutes. As Diana fumbled around in the darkness, gasping for the limited air, she felt her hands brush against other people. There were others trapped in the air pocket with her. She grabbed onto them, trying to communicate, but everyone was in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. With no way to swim down and no visibility, Diana realized their only option was to violently bang on the underside of the hull, hoping to alert whoever was on the outside that they were trapped within. Outside the overturned vessel, a different struggle was taking place. There were 11 people on the trip in total. When the boat capsized, 6 of them, including the skipper, a man named Mark, were thrown clear of the hull and into the open ocean. As Mark swam through the choppy water, he suddenly heard a distinct, frantic knocking sound echoing from beneath the upside-down boat. Mark immediately understood what was happening. While he and the other 5 survivors outside were facing a life-or-death scenario in the freezing ocean, the people trapped underneath were in far more immediate danger. Mark quickly gathered the 5 people with him to ensure they could stay afloat, and then he climbed up onto the slippery, exposed bottom of the flipped boat. He knew the vessel was large enough to support their weight without sinking further, and getting out of the water was their best chance at delaying hypothermia. Once on top, Mark began banging back on the hull, shouting to the people inside to let them know they had been heard. The scene was chaotic. The engine was still roaring loudly, the ocean was choppy, and nobody knew if the boat might suddenly sink to the bottom. In a stroke of luck, Mark checked the pockets of one of the survivors who had climbed up with him and found a cell phone. Despite being submerged, the phone miraculously still worked. Mark immediately called the emergency authorities, reporting the capsizing and emphasizing that multiple people were trapped under the water. The dispatcher assured him that a rescue team was being deployed immediately. Inside the dark pocket, Diana and the 4 others were running out of time. The air was growing increasingly thin, and the choppy water inside the cavity caused them to repeatedly gulp down mouthfuls of water as they struggled to keep their heads up. They kept pounding on the hull, begging for rescue. Some considered deflating or ditching their life jackets to attempt to dive to safety, but the risks were terrifying. Ditching their only flotation device in pitch darkness without knowing what debris or obstacles blocked the exit could mean drowning instantly. So they chose to wait, continuously knocking against the metal. True to their word, the rescue authorities arrived on the scene remarkably fast. They safely extracted Mark and the 5 other survivors from the top of the capsized vessel. Immediately after, rescue divers plunged into the water, swimming underneath the overturned hull to reach the air pocket. They found all 5 passengers, including Diana, exactly where they had been waiting. Tragically, however, all 5 were completely unresponsive. Despite the rapid arrival of the rescue team, all 5 individuals were pronounced deceased. When the medical examiners later conducted their investigation, they discovered a twist that no one could have anticipated. The 5 victims had not died from drowning, nor had they succumbed to the freezing hypothermia of the Pacific waters. When the massive whale originally rammed the side of the boat and caused it to flip, the violent impact had ruptured the vessel's internal gasoline lines. Because the boat was resting upside down, this rupture caused fuel to leak directly into the enclosed air pocket. The dark, freezing cavity where Diana and her companions were trapped had rapidly filled with highly toxic gasoline fumes. Within just 17 minutes of the capsizing, the concentrated fumes completely overwhelmed their respiratory systems, and all 5 passengers tragically died of gasoline poisoning before rescue could reach them. On Sunday, the 6th of November 2022, a 21-year-old man named Yevgeny Titov stepped out of his home in Yagolovsk, a small, quiet city located in western Russia. To anyone watching, it seemed like an ordinary weekend morning. Yevgeny calmly got into his car, turned the ignition, and drove about an hour and a half north until he reached a public parking lot. He parked his car, locked the doors, and walked a few blocks down the street toward the local train station. Upon entering the station, Yevgeny walked up to the ticket counter. With a calm and collected demeanor, he asked the clerk when the next available train was leaving for St. Petersburg. The clerk informed him that a train was scheduled to depart shortly. Yevgeny purchased a one-way ticket, walked out onto the platform, and sat down on a bench to wait. When the massive train finally rolled into the station, he climbed on board, found his assigned seat, and settled in. What followed was a grueling 3-hour journey, as St. Petersburg lay over 1,000 miles away. For nearly 2 full days, Yevgeny just sat in his seat, doing absolutely nothing to pass the time. He hadn't brought a backpack, a change of clothes, a book, or any food. He didn't even have a phone charger. The only item in his possession was his wallet. He simply stared out the window, watching the vast Russian landscape roll by, waiting patiently for the train to reach its final destination. Late on the night of Tuesday, November 8th, the train finally pulled into the station in St. Petersburg. Yevgeny, looking as calm as he had when he first started his journey, stood up and exited the train. From there, he traveled another 15 miles south to reach Pulkovo Airport. Investigators still do not know exactly how he made this final leg of the trip, whether he took a local bus, a secondary train, walked on foot, or hitched a ride with a stranger. Regardless of the method, he arrived at the airport in the dead of night. However, instead of entering the terminal to buy a plane ticket or board a flight, Yevgeny walked directly past the building and headed into a specific, secluded parking lot on the airport grounds. Several hours later, in the eerie, dark morning hours of Wednesday, November 9th, an airport employee was walking through that very same parking lot on their way to an early shift. The lot was mostly empty, and the air was freezing cold. As the person walked, they suddenly began to hear a strange, faint sound cutting through the silence. It sounded like muffled, distant screaming. At first, the traveler tried to rationalize the noise. Airports are busy places filled with stressed travelers, crying children, and people rushing around. Perhaps it was just someone goofing off or a child throwing a tantrum in the distance. But as they continued walking, the muffled screams grew louder and more desperate. Following the sound, the person's eyes landed on an open manhole cover situated in the middle of the parking lot. The terrifying truth became clear. The agonizing screams were echoing from deep inside the hole in the ground. For reasons that remain completely incomprehensible to this day, Yevgeny had approached that heavy cast-iron manhole cover, pried it open, and climbed down into the pitch-black subterranean world beneath the airport. At the bottom of the vertical shaft, the space was relatively wide, allowing a person to stand upright and move around. Branching off from this central chamber were various concrete and metal drainage pipes designed to carry water away from the airport grounds. Instead of staying in the wider, safer chamber, Yevgeny chose one specific pipe and lay down on his stomach. This particular pipe was made of rigid, rusted metal and measured a mere 30 centimeters, 1 foot in diameter. It was a space so incredibly narrow that a normal adult could barely squeeze their shoulders into it. Yet, Yevgeny plunged into the pipe headfirst, using his fingers and toes to deliberately crawl forward into the suffocating darkness. He didn't stop when the metal scraped against his skin. He didn't stop when the air grew thick and cold. He pushed himself forward, inch by inch, forcing his body deeper into the restriction until he had crawled nearly 12 meters for feet into the pipe. Finally, the laws of physics caught up with him. He had wedged himself so tightly into the narrow tube that he could no longer move forward, nor could he slide backward. He was completely paralyzed, trapped in a metal tomb under the earth. It was at that moment, in the dead of night, that the reality of his situation set in, and Yevgeny began to scream for his life. The traveler immediately called emergency services, and within minutes, the parking lot was flooded with police cars, fire trucks, and specialized rescue squads. Officers climbed down into the manhole and shone their flashlights into the pipe, only to see the soles of Yevgeny's shoes deep within the tunnel. The rescue operation was a logistical nightmare. The pipe was buried deep beneath thick layers of asphalt and concrete, and there was no way to pull him out by his feet without risking breaking his legs or snapping his spine. For hours, rescue teams used heavy jackhammers, industrial saws, and specialized digging equipment to break through the concrete of the airport parking lot. They carefully excavated the earth around the drainage system, working meticulously so they wouldn't collapse the pipe onto the trapped young man. Inside the pipe, Yevgeny was rapidly succumbing to the toxic underground gases and the freezing temperatures of the Russian winter soil. Somewhat unbelievably, after hours of intense, agonizing labor, the rescue crews managed to cut open a section of the metal pipe and pull Yevgeny out alive. He was immediately rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Yevgeny's survival was a miracle, but his body had paid a terrible price. He had to be hospitalized for a significant period due to severe, extensive skin damage caused by violently forcing his body against the rough, rusty interior of the 30-centimeter pipe. He also required intensive treatment for severe hypothermia and acute gas poisoning from inhaling subterranean fumes for hours. Following his remarkable physical recovery, authorities launched a massive, comprehensive investigation into the incident. The entire sequence of events defied logic. Why would a young man leave his home, travel over 1,000 miles without any belongings, just to crawl headfirst into a tiny drainage pipe beneath an airport parking lot? Was it a bizarre internet stunt? Was he fleeing from someone? Was it a drug-induced episode? When detectives finally sat down with Yevgeny in his hospital room to ask him these exact questions, they were met with a final twist that left them entirely baffled. Yevgeny was completely lucid, calm, and cooperative. However, he looked the investigators in the eyes and insisted that he had absolutely no memory of the past 3 days. He remembered being at home in Yagelovsk on Sunday, but everything after that, the 3-hour train ride, the airport parking lot, and the agonizing crawl into the 30-centimeter pipe was a total, impenetrable blank. To this day, the true motivation behind Yevgeny's terrifying journey remains buried in the dark, beneath the concrete of Saint Reality. Petersburg. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.